What if reality wasn't as stable as you think? What if the world around you occasionally bent, shifted, and glitched just enough for you to notice? Across history, people have reported strange moments when memory, perception, or even time itself refused to behave. These aren't bugs in video games, but glitches in real life, moments when reality itself seems to falter. Tonight, for 3 hours, we'll wander through these strange cracks in existence. From memories of events that never happened to déjà vu, phantom vibrations, and entire histories remembered differently. And it begins with one of the most famous glitches of all, the Mandela Effect. You remember it clearly. Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s. You saw the news coverage. You remember the funeral. The world mourned, except he didn't die then. He lived until 2013, became South Africa's president, changed history. But your memory insists otherwise. This isn't just you. Thousands of people share this exact false memory. They remember the same funeral that never happened, the same news reports that were never broadcast, the same collective grief for a death that didn't occur when they think it did. Welcome to the Mandela Effect, a glitch where reality and memory refuse to align, where entire groups of people remember a different version of history, not similar memories, identical ones, down to specific details that never existed. The Berenstain Bears become the Berenstain Bears. Curious George loses his tail. The Monopoly Man's monocle vanishes. Movie quotes change. Song lyrics shift. Brand names morph, and thousands of people notice at exactly the same time. Scientists call it false memory, a trick of the brain, mass confabulation. But the precision troubles them. False memories should be messy, personal, unique. These aren't. They're shared, specific, consistent across cultures and continents. Some say parallel universes are bleeding through. Others blame time travelers changing the past. The skeptical point to the internet, creating false consensus. But none of these explanations feel complete. Maybe memory isn't what we think it is. Maybe the past isn't as solid as it seems. Maybe reality has always been more fluid than we wanted to believe. And maybe, just maybe, some glitches run deeper than consciousness itself. What else do you remember that never was? Déjà vu. The conversation stops mid-sentence, not because anyone planned it, but because this exact moment has happened before. You know what she's going to say next. You know how the light will shift. You know the taste of recognition flooding your mouth. But you've never been here before. Never had this conversation. Never met this person until today. Yet every detail feels carved into memory. The way she tilts her head, the sound of traffic outside, the smell of coffee cooling in forgotten cups. Déjà vu, already seen. A glitch in the matrix of experience, where the present masquerades as the past, where new moments arrive wearing the clothes of old memories, where time seems to stutter and repeat itself. Scientists say it's a misfiring between brain regions. The temporal lobe creating false familiarity, a neurological hiccup that makes the new feel ancient, but the experience feels like more than a glitch. It feels like glimpsing the script of existence. Some people experience it once or twice in their lives. Others live with it daily. There are those who claim it comes before important decisions, a warning from consciousness itself, a sign that certain moments matter more than others. The feeling fades as quickly as it arrives. Reality snaps back into focus. The conversation continues, but something lingers. A whisper that time isn't as linear as we pretend, that maybe all moments exist simultaneously, and sometimes the boundaries blur. Maybe déjà vu isn't about remembering the past. Maybe it's about remembering the future. Or maybe it's about remembering that memory itself is stranger than we dare to imagine. The moment passes, but the question remains. The Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon. You learn a new word on Tuesday, something obscure, something you've never heard before. By Friday, you've encountered it 6 times. In a book, on the radio, In casual conversation, painted on a wall, you walk past every day but somehow never noticed. This isn't coincidence. This is Baader-Meinhof, also called the frequency illusion. The universe's way of making the invisible suddenly everywhere, as if learning something new turns on a switch in reality itself. The name comes from a German terrorist group most people had never heard of, until they did. And then they saw references everywhere, in newspapers, in documentaries, in conversations they swore weren't happening before. The group hadn't become more active. The world had simply started paying attention. Your brain filters millions of pieces of information every second. Most of it gets discarded, deemed irrelevant, background noise. But when something new enters your awareness, the filter changes. What was once invisible becomes highlighted. What was once noise becomes signal. But it feels like more than selective attention. It feels like the world is responding to your curiosity, like reality itself is trying to teach you something, like the universe has been waiting for you to notice. Maybe it has. Maybe awareness creates its own kind of magnetism. Maybe learning something new doesn't just change what you see. Maybe it changes what exists to be seen. Maybe the act of knowing summons more of what you need to know. Or maybe the world has always been full of patterns we're too distracted to notice. And sometimes, just sometimes, our attention aligns with the hidden frequencies that surround us. Either way, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Phantom vibrations. Your phone is buzzing. You reach for your pocket. Nothing there. You check your other pocket. Empty. Your bag. Your desk. Your phone is across the room. Silent. Screen dark. No missed calls. No messages. No notifications. But you felt it, that unmistakable vibration against your leg. Brief, but definite. Real enough to make you move. Real enough to interrupt your thoughts. Real enough to remind you how much of your attention lives in waiting for that buzz. This is phantom vibration syndrome, a hallucination of the digital age, your nervous system creating sensations that don't exist, your brain so accustomed to constant connectivity that it fills in the gaps with imaginary alerts. Studies show it happens to nearly everyone who owns a smartphone. The phantom buzz, the false alarm, the ghost in the machine of modern life. Your body has learned the rhythm of digital interruption so well it plays the song, even when the orchestra is silent. Some say it's anxiety, the fear of missing something important. Others call it addiction, the withdrawal symptoms of disconnection. But maybe it's simpler. Maybe it's just your nervous system trying to make sense of a world that changes faster than evolution can adapt. You used to feel phantom limbs after amputation. Now you feel phantom phones after forgetting them at home. The same neurological process, the brain refusing to accept that something important is missing, the mind creating what it needs to feel complete. But what happens when the phantom sensations become more real than the real ones? What happens when you trust the hallucination more than your actual phone? What happens when your body starts living in a reality that doesn't exist? Maybe that's already happened. Maybe we all carry phantom devices now. Maybe the real glitch isn't the false vibration. Maybe it's forgetting what silence used to feel like. The Tetris Effect. You see Tetris pieces in bathroom tiles, in skyscrapers, in the way books stack on shelves. Reality reorganizes itself into falling shapes. Your brain can't stop solving puzzles that don't exist. Can't stop seeing patterns that aren't there. You've been playing for hours. Falling blocks, perfect lines, the faction of completion. Then you close your eyes to sleep, but the blocks keep falling. Behind your eyelids, in your dreams, in the space between sleeping and waking. This is the Tetris Effect. When repetitive activities colonize your visual cortex, when your brain becomes so focused on one pattern, it starts imposing that pattern on everything else. When the game you were playing starts playing you. It happens with more than games. Medical students start diagnosing strangers on the subway. Chess players see the world as a board. Programmers dream in code. Musicians hear melodies in conversation. Your dominant activity becomes your dominant reality. The effect was first noticed in the 1990s. Players reporting blocks in their peripheral vision, geometric dreams, waking thoughts organized around 7 basic shapes, as if Tetris had hacked the visual processing system and refused to log out. But maybe this reveals something deeper about how minds work. Maybe we're always playing Tetris with reality, always trying to fit the chaos of experience into manageable patterns, always looking for ways to make the pieces fit. And maybe, in a world of screens and patterns and endless repetition, we're all falling blocks now, all trying to find our place in someone else's game, all hoping to complete a line that will make everything disappear. Maybe the real Tetris effect isn't about games at all. Maybe it's about how any repeated experience reshapes perception itself, how what you practice becomes what you see, how the tools you use start using you back. But the blocks keep falling, and the game never ends. Jamais Vu. You're walking through your neighborhood, the same route you've taken 1,000 times, past the blue house, around the corner, down the familiar street. But something is wrong. Nothing looks right. These streets are foreign. This house is a stranger. This path leads somewhere you've never been. But you have been here. You live here. This is your home. Your brain knows this. Your feet know this. Your muscle memory guides you forward. But your recognition is gone, vanished, as if someone erased the familiarity from your mind and left only the facts. This is Jamais Vu, never seen, the opposite of déjà vu. When the most familiar becomes completely foreign, when your own reflection looks like a stranger, when your name sounds like nonsense, when home becomes a place you've never been. It's more unsettling than déjà vu. False familiarity feels magical. False unfamiliarity feels like losing your mind, like waking up in someone else's life, like discovering you're an actor who forgot their lines in a play you've performed every day. Sometimes it happens with words. You write "the," and suddenly it looks wrong, foreign, made up. You stare at letters you've known since childhood, and they become hieroglyphs. The building blocks of language crumble into meaningless shapes. Scientists think it's about pattern recognition breaking down, the brain temporarily losing access to stored associations, like a computer unable to match a file with its location. The information is still there, but the connection is severed. Maybe Jamais Vu shows us how fragile familiarity really is, how much of what feels permanent is actually a constant act of recognition, how much energy consciousness spends making the world feel like home. And maybe, sometimes, it's good to see familiar things as if for the first time, to remember that everything you take for granted was once completely new, to realize that the ordinary world is actually extraordinary. You just got used to the miracle. The feeling passes. Recognition returns. Home becomes home again. But something lingers. A reminder that familiarity is a gift, not a given. Cryptomnesia. You wake up with the perfect solution. The idea came to you in a dream, or maybe in the shower, or during that moment between sleeping and waking when insights arrive like gifts. It's brilliant. It's original. It's yours. Except it's not. You heard it somewhere. Read it in a book. Saw it in a documentary you forgot watching. Your unconscious mind filed it away, stripped it of context, and served it back as inspiration. What feels like creation is actually recreation. What seems original is actually borrowed. This is cryptomnesia, hidden memory. When the source vanishes but the content remains. When someone else's thoughts migrate into your mind and set up residence. When inspiration becomes indistinguishable from remembering. Musicians discover they've unconsciously plagiarized melodies. Writers realize their breakthrough insights came from forgotten conversations. Scientists find their revolutionary theories in old journals they don't remember reading. The line between influence and theft blurs beyond recognition. But maybe this reveals something profound about how creativity actually works. Maybe all ideas are conversations between minds separated by time and space. Maybe originality is just forgetting where you heard something. Maybe the fear of unconscious plagiarism misses the point entirely. Perhaps cryptomnesia is how culture actually spreads, how wisdom gets passed down, how the best ideas transcend their creators and become part of collective consciousness. Maybe the real magic isn't creating something from nothing. Maybe it's letting something work through you that's bigger than you. Your unconscious mind doesn't respect copyright. It doesn't care about attribution. It collects everything and remixes constantly. It takes the fragments of everything you've ever encountered and builds new combinations. What emerges feels like inspiration but might be closer to collaboration with your forgotten self. Maybe the question isn't whether your ideas are truly yours. Maybe the question is whether true ownership of ideas is even possible. Maybe everything is cryptomnesia. Maybe consciousness itself is just borrowed thoughts we've forgotten how to return. The insight still feels real, even if it isn't originally yours. The doorway effect. You walk into the kitchen with purpose, something important to do, something you needed to remember, something that felt urgent just moments ago. But the doorway erases it. Standing in the new room, you draw a complete blank. The purpose vanishes. The urgency dissolves. The memory dies in transition. You retrace your steps, back through the doorway, back to where the thought began, and suddenly it returns. Clear as before, urgent as before, ready to be forgotten, again the moment you cross another threshold. This is the doorway effect, also called location updating. When moving between spaces erases working memory, when architecture becomes amnesia, when the simple act of changing rooms changes what you can remember. Scientists think it's about how the brain organizes information. Memories get tagged with locations. When you change locations, the brain assumes the old information is no longer relevant. It clears the cache, starts fresh, prioritizes new input over old intentions. But maybe doorways are more powerful than we realize. Maybe they're not just physical barriers. Maybe they're psychological ones. Gateways between different versions of yourself. Portals that separate who you were from who you're becoming. Think about the doorways in your life, the ones that marked real transitions. Leaving home, starting school, beginning relationships, ending them. Some thresholds change more than your location. They change who you are on the other side. Maybe the doorway effect is evolution's way of helping you adapt, forgetting what's no longer useful, clearing mental space for what comes next. Maybe forgetting isn't a bug. Maybe it's a feature. Maybe every doorway is an invitation to become someone new. Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe your brain just treats every room like a different world. And maybe in some ways, every room really is a different world, with different rules, different purposes, different versions of you. The thought will come back when you return to where it started. Memory is more fragile than we want to believe, but maybe that fragility is also its strength. Presque Vu. It's right there, on the tip of your tongue, the word you need, the name you know, the answer that's hiding just behind consciousness. You can feel its shape, its rhythm, its meaning hovers in the space between knowing and not knowing, but it won't surface. This is Presque Vu, almost seen, the frustrating cousin of Déjà Vu. When knowledge exists but refuses to become conscious, when memory plays hide and seek with awareness, when you know that you know but knowing isn't enough. The feeling is maddening. Your brain insists the information is there, filed correctly, available for retrieval, but something blocks access. Some glitch in the connection between storage and consciousness. The harder you try to remember, the more elusive it becomes. Sometimes it's a name, someone familiar but unnamed. You can picture their face, remember conversations, recall their laugh, but their identity remains locked behind a door you can't quite open. The frustration builds. The silence stretches. The word hovers just out of reach. Sometimes it breaks free suddenly, without warning. Without effort, what was impossible becomes obvious. The blockage clears. The connection repairs itself. Relief floods through, like breaking a fever. But the question lingers. Where did it go, and why couldn't you reach it? Maybe Presque Vu reveals the gap between knowledge and access, between having information and being able to use it. Maybe it shows how much of what you know remains hidden, how much of memory is perpetually almost visible. Or maybe it's about the difference between automatic recall and conscious retrieval. Maybe most knowledge works in the background. Maybe bringing it to consciousness requires a special kind of effort. Maybe Presque Vu is what happens when that effort fails. The word will come to you later, when you're not trying, when your attention is elsewhere, when conscious effort gives up and lets unconscious processes do their work. Maybe that's the real lesson. Maybe some things can only be found when you stop looking. But for now, it remains almost seen, almost known, almost yours. L'esprit de l'escalier. You're walking away from the conversation. The perfect response finally arrives. The brilliant comeback, the witty retort that would have demolished their argument, the insight that would have changed everything. But it's too late. The moment has passed. The conversation is over. The opportunity has vanished. This is l'esprit de l'escalier, French for staircase wit. The phenomenon of thinking of the perfect thing to say after the moment to say it has passed. When your brain delivers exactly the right words at exactly the wrong time. When wisdom arrives just after it would have been useful. It happens constantly. In arguments, in job interviews, in social situations. Your mind goes blank when you need it most, then floods with insights when they're useless. The pressure of real-time interaction seems to block access to your own intelligence. Only in retrospect does clarity emerge. Maybe it's about performance anxiety, the stress of social interaction disrupting cognitive function, the pressure to respond quickly, overwhelming the capacity to respond well. When the stakes feel high, thinking feels difficult. When judgment matters most, judgment disappears. Or maybe it's about processing time. Complex thoughts need time to develop. Nuanced insights require reflection. But conversation demands immediate response. The mismatch between thinking speed and speaking speed creates the gap where perfect responses hide until they're no longer needed. The phenomenon suggests that your best thinking happens in private rather than public, in reflection rather than reaction, in solitude rather than society. Maybe this is why writing feels different from speaking, why email arguments feel more articulate than face-to-face debates. But l'esprit de l'escalier also reveals the reconstructive nature of memory. Maybe the perfect response you think of later wouldn't have been so perfect in the moment. Maybe hindsight creates better comebacks than foresight could have. Maybe the wit of the staircase is partly fictional. Think about your own delayed insights. The arguments you won hours after they ended. The jokes you thought of days after they would have been funny. The explanations you developed weeks after they were needed. Maybe delayed wisdom is better than immediate foolishness. Some cultures build in processing time, deliberation periods before important decisions, reflection intervals between question and answer, recognition that good thinking requires time that social interaction rarely provides. Maybe l'esprit de l'escalier shows the wisdom of slowing down. The perfect response echoes in your mind. Brilliant, devastating, useless. But maybe the real insight isn't what you should have said, but why you didn't say it. Maybe l'esprit de l'escalier reveals something about the difference between social performance and private reflection, between thinking under pressure and thinking with patience. Maybe that's why the staircase response feels so perfect, because it's crafted in solitude rather than stress, developed in reflection rather than reaction. Created with the luxury of time that real conversation never provides, the wit of hindsight rather than the panic of the present moment. False awakening. You open your eyes, sunlight streams through familiar windows. Your bedroom, your bed. The dream is over, time to start the day. You sit up, Swing your legs over the edge. Feel your feet touch the floor. Everything is normal. Everything is real. Everything is exactly as it should be. Except you're still dreaming. This awakening is false. This reality is fabricated. This normal morning is another layer of sleep, but you don't know it yet. Won't know it until you actually wake up. Won't realize the deception until consciousness finally arrives. False awakening. When dreams simulate waking. When sleep imitates consciousness so perfectly, you can't tell the difference. When your mind creates a copy of reality indistinguishable from the original, until suddenly it isn't. Sometimes it happens multiple times. You wake up from the false awakening only to discover that awakening was false too. Layers of simulated consciousness. Russian dolls of artificial morning. Each one feeling completely real until the next one proves it was fake. The experience raises uncomfortable questions. If false awakening can feel identical to real awakening, how do you know when you're actually awake? How do you distinguish between authentic consciousness and its simulation? How do you trust the reality you're experiencing right now? Maybe the boundary between sleeping and waking is more porous than we want to believe. Maybe consciousness exists on a spectrum rather than as a binary state. Maybe what we call awakening is just another kind of dream, one we happen to share with others. Some people learn to recognize false awakenings, develop reality checks, look for inconsistencies, test the physics of their experience. But the really good false awakenings include the reality checks, include the testing, include the doubt itself. Maybe that's the real lesson of false awakening. Not that dreams can fool us, but that reality might be more dreamlike than we realize. That consciousness itself might be a kind of controlled hallucination. That the difference between real and simulated experience might be smaller than we think. You eventually wake up for real. The false morning dissolves. The simulation ends. But something lingers. A question about the nature of awakening itself. A doubt about the solidity of consciousness. How do you know you're awake right now? Highway hypnosis. The highway stretches ahead, white lines, gray asphalt, endless repetition. Your hands grip the wheel. Your foot maintains pressure on the pedal. Miles pass. Minutes pass. Time becomes distance, becomes time, and then suddenly you're somewhere else. Not physically. You never left the road, never lost control, never endangered anyone, but mentally, you vanished. Your conscious mind went somewhere else while your body continued driving. Autopilot engaged. Unconscious competence took over. You became a passenger in your own vehicle. This is highway hypnosis, also called white line fever, when repetitive driving induces a trance state, when conscious awareness fades while automatic behavior continues, when you arrive at your destination with no memory of the journey. It's not sleep. You respond to traffic, adjust speed, make turns, navigate safely. Your brain processes visual information, makes decisions, executes movements. But consciousness isn't present. The observer has left the building. The body drives itself. Maybe this reveals how much of behavior is automatic, how many actions happen without conscious control, how much of daily life runs on autopilot while awareness focuses elsewhere. Maybe consciousness is more optional than we realize. Think about walking. You don't consciously move each muscle. Don't deliberate about each step. The process runs itself while you think about other things. Maybe driving becomes similar after enough repetition. Maybe the brain delegates routine tasks to free up attention. But highway hypnosis feels different from other automatic behaviors. More complete, more disconnected. Like temporarily ceasing to exist while your body continues living. Like discovering you can be absent from your own experience. Some people find it frightening. The idea of unconscious driving, of missing chunks of their lives, of being present, but not present. Others find it peaceful, a break from the constant noise of consciousness, a vacation from self-awareness. Maybe both responses are correct. Maybe highway hypnosis is simultaneously dangerous and therapeutic. Maybe it's a glitch in attention that's also a feature of how minds work. Maybe the capacity to fade out is as important as the ability to focus in. The trance ends when something changes. Traffic thickens. Weather shifts. You need to exit. Consciousness returns, like waking from a dream. But for a while, you were somewhere else entirely, even though you never left. Semantic satiation. Say your name out loud. Again. Again. Keep repeating it. 10 times. 20. 30. Listen to the sounds. The syllables. The rhythm. Notice how it starts to change. How familiar becomes foreign. How meaning dissolves into pure sound. Your name becomes nonsense. The word that defines your identity becomes meaningless noise. Letters arranged without purpose. Sounds signifying nothing. The most personal word in your vocabulary empties itself of content through repetition. This is semantic satiation. When repetition kills meaning, when overuse drains words of their significance, when the connection between sound and sense temporarily breaks, when language reveals its artificial nature. It works with any word. Table becomes te and bull. Chair becomes che and air. Beautiful becomes beautiful. The automatic association between sound and meaning shuts down, like a mental muscle growing tired from overuse, like consciousness protecting itself from redundancy. Maybe this reveals how fragile language really is, how much meaning depends on scarcity, how repetition can kill what it's meant to preserve. Maybe words are like jokes. They stop working when you explain them too much. Or maybe semantic satiation shows the difference between sound and symbol, between the physical vibration of speech and the mental content of meaning. Maybe it demonstrates how much mental effort goes into maintaining the illusion that words mean things. Children discover this naturally. They repeat a word until it becomes silly, until meaning collapses into giggles, until language reveals itself as a game. Maybe they understand something adults forget. Maybe meaning is more fragile than we pretend. But semantic satiation is temporary. Leave the word alone and meaning returns. The connection repairs itself. The association reactivates. But something has been revealed. The gap between sound and sense. The effort required to maintain language. The fragility of meaning itself. Maybe that's why poetry works, why lyrics matter, why certain combinations of words feel powerful while others feel empty. Maybe the art is in avoiding satiation, in using repetition to build meaning rather than destroy it, in knowing when enough becomes too much. Your name means something again, but you've heard its meaninglessness. You've experienced the void beneath language. You've discovered that words are more magical and more fragile than they appear to be. The overview effect. You rise above the atmosphere. Earth shrinks below. Borders disappear. Countries become patches of color. Cities become points of light. The blue marble floats in infinite darkness, fragile, unified alone. This is the overview effect, the cognitive shift that happens when you see Earth from space. When perspective changes everything, when the familiar planet becomes a foreign object, when home becomes a destination. Astronauts describe it as spiritual awakening, profound transformation. The sudden understanding that divisions are arbitrary, that nationalism is meaningless, that all of humanity shares one small world in a vast emptiness, that survival depends on cooperation, not competition. The effect is immediate and lasting. Religious astronauts become more spiritual. Secular ones develop reverence. Scientists become philosophers. Engineers become poets. The view from space changes how people see everything else. But why? What is it about distance that creates wisdom? What is it about perspective that generates empathy? Why does seeing Earth as an object make humans feel more connected to each other? Maybe it's about scale. From space, human conflicts look absurd. Wars become invisible. Borders vanish. The things that divide us disappear while what unites us becomes obvious. Maybe distance provides clarity that proximity obscures. Or maybe it's about vulnerability. Earth looks fragile from space. The atmosphere is thinner than skin. The surface is mostly empty ocean. Life clings to a narrow band between the vacuum of space and the fire of the core. Survival looks miraculous rather than guaranteed. Most people will never experience the overview effect directly, never see Earth from space, never gain that perspective, but maybe the effect can be simulated. Maybe imagination can provide what altitude cannot. Maybe the view from space is really a view from consciousness. Some use photographs, meditation, virtual reality, psychedelics, dreams, anything that can shift perspective radically enough to see familiar things as foreign, to see home as habitat, to see humanity as singular rather than plural. Maybe the overview effect isn't about space travel. Maybe it's about mental travel, about the capacity to step outside normal perspective and see things as they really are, about discovering that the view changes everything, including the viewer. Time dilation during crisis. The car slides toward the guardrail. Time stretches. Seconds become hours. You see everything in perfect detail. The texture of the asphalt, the rust on the metal barrier, the fear in your passenger's eyes. Your hands turn the wheel with deliberate precision. The world moves in slow motion while your mind accelerates. This is time dilation during crisis, when emergency situations alter the perception of time, when life-threatening moments feel like they last forever, when seconds expand to contain impossible amounts of experience, when consciousness and chronology decouple. It's not just about adrenaline, though adrenaline plays a role. It's about attention. Crisis focuses the mind completely, eliminates distraction, makes every detail relevant. When nothing can be ignored, everything becomes vivid. When survival depends on awareness, awareness expands. Maybe this reveals how time perception actually works. Maybe duration is really about information processing. Maybe seconds feel long when they contain more data. Maybe time moves slowly when consciousness moves quickly. Think about childhood summers. They felt endless, not because they were longer, but because they were denser. Every day contained new experiences, novel situations, unfamiliar sensations. The mind processed more information, so time felt expanded. But adult routine compresses time. Familiar days blend together. Repeated experiences get abbreviated. Less attention means less. Detail means shorter subjective duration. Weeks vanish because nothing distinguished them from each other. Crisis breaks routine completely, forces total attention, makes every detail potentially crucial. The mind records everything because everything might matter. Time dilates because consciousness intensifies. Maybe this is why some people seek dangerous experiences, extreme sports, high-risk activities, near-death encounters, not because they want to die, but because they want to feel alive, want to experience time at full resolution, want to escape the compression of routine. The crisis passes. Time resumes normal speed. But something lingers. A memory of enhanced existence, of seconds that felt like hours, of consciousness operating at maximum capacity, of time as experience rather than measurement. Maybe that's what time really is. Not the tick of clocks, but the depth of attention. Not the passage of moments, but the richness of awareness. Maybe time dilation during crisis isn't an illusion. Maybe it's time at its most real. The Reminiscence Bump. Your teenage years feel more real than last week. The songs from high school sound clearer than yesterday's playlist. The faces from 15 feel more vivid than the people you met 5 minutes ago. The past is more present than the present. Memory plays favorites with time. This is the Reminiscence Bump, the psychological phenomenon where memories from adolescence and early adulthood feel disproportionately important, where experiences from ages 15 to 25 dominate autobiographical memory, where the most distant past outshines the recent present. It's not just nostalgia, it's about identity formation. The teenage years are when you become who you are, when preferences solidify, when personality crystallizes, when the self emerges from the chaos of childhood. These memories feel more real because they made you real. First love feels more significant than current relationships. High school friendships seem deeper than adult ones. Music from your teenage years sounds like the soundtrack of existence, while new songs feel like background noise. The past outcompetes the present because it created the present. Maybe it's about neuroplasticity. Teenage brains are more changeable, more impressionable. Experiences carve deeper grooves, leave stronger traces, create more vivid memories because they literally change the structure of the mind that's remembering them. Or maybe it's about novelty. Everything is new when you're young. First experiences of independence, first tastes of freedom, first encounters with consequence. Novelty creates stronger memories. Stronger memories feel more important. More important memories shape identity. But the reminiscence bump also creates problems. It makes people feel like their best years are behind them, like nothing current can compete with past glory, like they peaked in high school and everything since has been decline. The past becomes a prison of impossible standards. Maybe the solution isn't to forget the past, but to create new firsts, new experiences intense enough to compete with teenage memories, new challenges that force growth, new relationships that matter as much as old ones. Maybe the reminiscence bump can be extended rather than escaped. Or maybe it's about recognizing that all memory is selective, that the past feels more vivid because you've edited out the boring parts, that teenage years weren't actually perfect, that the present moment is creating the memories that will someday overshadow it. Your teenage years made you who you are, but who you are is still becoming. The reminiscence bump shows the power of formative experiences, but every experience has the potential to be formative, even this one. Phantom limb syndrome. The arm is gone. Amputated months ago. The wound healed. The bandages removed. The physical reality accepted. But the arm remains. Not visually, not tangibly, but sensationally. You can still feel fingers that don't exist. Still sense movement in muscles that aren't there, still experience pain in flesh that was discarded. This is phantom limb syndrome. When the brain refuses to accept loss, when the nervous system maintains a map of territory that no longer exists, when consciousness clings to completeness despite physical evidence of absence, the sensations can be vivid, precise, maddening. You try to scratch an itch on a phantom hand. Reach for objects with an arm that isn't there. Feel cramping in muscles that were removed. The disconnect between sensation and reality creates a unique form of suffering. But maybe phantom limbs reveal something profound about how consciousness constructs the body. Maybe the physical form is just one layer of embodied existence. Maybe there's a deeper body, a neural body, a psychological body that persists, even when the physical body changes. The phantom sensations aren't random. They reflect the brain's stored patterns of movement and sensation. The more a body part was used, the stronger the phantom becomes. Dominant hands create stronger phantoms than subordinate ones. Active limbs leave more vivid ghosts than passive ones. Maybe this explains why phantom limbs can sometimes be treated with mirrors, by tricking the brain into seeing the missing limb move, by providing visual feedback that matches phantom sensations, by reuniting the neural map with external reality. The phantom fades when the brain believes the limb has been restored. But phantom limbs aren't limited to amputees. People born without limbs sometimes experience phantoms of parts they never had, suggesting the brain comes pre-programmed with a complete body map, that consciousness expects a certain form regardless of physical reality. Maybe we're all living with phantom limbs, parts of ourselves we've lost, but still feel, abilities that have atrophied but still ache, potentials that were never realized but still generate sensations. Maybe grief is a kind of phantom limb syndrome for relationships that no longer exist. The phantom eventually fades for most people. The brain slowly accepts the new reality, updates its map, redistributes function. But something always remains, a ghost in the machine of embodied consciousness. A reminder that the body is more than its parts, that identity persists even when form changes. Maybe phantom limbs aren't glitches. Maybe they're evidence of something that can't be amputated, something that exists beyond physical boundaries, something that remains when everything else is gone. The Google Effect. You can't remember your best friend's phone number, or your own, or any phone numbers at all, but you can remember dozens of passwords, website addresses, search terms that will find what you need. Your memory has reorganized itself around the assumption that information is always available. This is the Google Effect, also called digital amnesia. When external storage replaces internal memory, when knowing how to find information becomes more important than knowing the information itself. When your smartphone becomes an external brain and your actual brain becomes an index, the change happened gradually. First, you stopped memorizing phone numbers because they were stored in your phone, then addresses because GPS could guide you anywhere, then facts because search engines could retrieve anything, then opinions because social media could provide endless perspectives. Your memory didn't disappear, it adapted. Why remember what you can instantly access? Why store internally what exists externally? Why burden consciousness with facts when you can fill it with experiences? The brain delegates storage to focus on processing. But something feels lost. The texture of knowledge, the weight of carried facts, the satisfaction of knowing without looking. Information feels less yours when it's borrowed rather than owned, less permanent when it requires connection rather than reflection. Maybe this reveals how memory actually works, not as storage but as pattern recognition, not as a library but as an indexing system. Maybe human memory was never meant to hold facts. Maybe it was meant to organize experiences, to create meaning from chaos, to find connections rather than store content. Or maybe the Google Effect is just the latest evolution of human intelligence. Writing systems already externalized memory. Books expanded storage capacity. Now digital networks provide instant access to collective knowledge. Maybe each step makes individual memory less necessary but collective intelligence more powerful. The trade-off feels uneven sometimes. You've gained access to all human knowledge, but lost the ability to remember where you put your keys. You can find any fact but can't recall your childhood phone number. The external brain grows stronger while the internal one grows dependent. But maybe dependence isn't weakness. Maybe it's efficiency. Maybe the Google Effect isn't about losing memory. Maybe it's about transforming it, about becoming better at knowing how to know rather than knowing what to know. Your phone dies, and suddenly you're lost without GPS, but you also navigate social situations with unprecedented skill. You forget basic math, but solve complex problems. You can't remember facts, but you can create meaning. Maybe that's the real trade-off. Storage for synthesis, facts for wisdom, memory for intelligence. Temporal illusions. 5 minutes in the dentist chair feels like 5 hours. 5 hours with a good friend feels like 5 minutes. The clock moves at constant speed, but time refuses to cooperate. Duration stretches and contracts independent of measurement. Subjective time and objective time live in different universes. This is temporal illusion, when psychological time diverges from physical time, when waiting makes minutes eternal while flow makes hours vanish, when boredom dilates duration while engagement compresses it, when your internal clock argues with external ones. The effect is dramatic. A watched pot never boils because attention makes time crawl. A great conversation ends too soon because enjoyment makes time fly. Pain extends moments while pleasure abbreviates them. Anxiety stretches waiting while absorption eliminates it entirely. Maybe this reveals something fundamental about how consciousness works. Maybe time isn't what you experience. Maybe time is how you experience. Maybe duration is really about the density of awareness rather than the passage of moments. Think about dreams. They can feel like they last hours while occupying minutes of sleep, or feel instantaneous while containing elaborate narratives. Dream time operates by different rules, psychological rules rather than physical ones. Maybe waking time is more dreamlike than we realize. Children experience time differently than adults. Summer vacations feel endless. School days drag forever. Christmas takes centuries to arrive, but adult time accelerates. Years blur together, decades vanish. Maybe it's not that time speeds up. Maybe it's that attention density changes. Novel experiences slow time down. Familiar routines speed it up. First times feel longer than repeated times. Dangerous moments expand while safe ones contract. Maybe time perception is really novelty perception. Maybe duration correlates with the amount of new information processed. But temporal illusions can be manipulated. Meditation slows subjective time by increasing awareness. Flow states compress it by reducing self-consciousness. Mindfulness expands present moments while distraction collapses them. Maybe time control is attention control. Some cultures think about time differently, past and future, as equally real. Cyclical time rather than linear time. Eternal present rather than fleeting moments. Maybe temporal illusions reveal how cultural the experience of time really is. How much of duration is constructed rather than discovered. The clock keeps ticking at steady intervals, but your experience of those intervals changes constantly, stretching with boredom, contracting with joy, expanding with attention, disappearing with absorption. Maybe that's the real nature of time. Not measurement, but experience. Not duration, but density. Time isn't what happens to you. Time is what you make of what happens to you. The Bizarreness Effect. You remember the dream about flying elephants with perfect clarity, but you can't recall what you had for breakfast. You remember the joke about the philosopher and the penguin, but forget important deadlines. You remember embarrassing moments from childhood, but lose track of recent accomplishments. Memory favors the strange over the significant. This is the Bizarreness Effect. When unusual information sticks while normal information fades. When weirdness wins over importance. When the mind prefers extraordinary content to ordinary content. When memory becomes a collector of curiosities rather than a keeper of facts. It makes evolutionary sense. Unusual events might signal danger or opportunity. Novel situations require more attention. Strange experiences might contain crucial information. The brain treats bizarreness as relevance, weirdness as worthiness, strangeness as significance. But the effect can be counterproductive. You remember the funny commercial, but forget the product name. You remember the strange anecdote, but miss the important lesson. You remember the weird detail, but lose the crucial context. Bizarreness captures attention but doesn't guarantee understanding. Maybe this explains why stories work better than facts for communication. Why metaphors stick more than definitions. Why examples outlast explanations. Why the strange detail illuminates the whole picture. Bizarreness isn't a bug in memory. It's a feature, a way of marking what matters. Educators use this intuitively. They tell weird stories to illustrate normal concepts. Use strange examples to explain familiar principles. Create bizarre mnemonics to remember boring facts. They know that weirdness is a pathway to permanence, that memory responds to surprise more than repetition. But the Bizarreness Effect has limits. Too much weirdness overwhelms processing. Too many strange details cancel each other out. The optimal level is just enough unusualness to grab attention without creating confusion. Just enough surprise to enhance rather than hinder comprehension. Maybe the real insight is about the relationship between attention and memory. What you remember isn't what happens to you, it's what you notice about what happens to you. Bizarreness forces noticing, weirdness creates attention. Strangeness generates awareness. And maybe that's why life feels so forgettable sometimes. Too much routine, too little surprise, too many normal days blending into indistinguishable weeks. Maybe the cure for forgettable life isn't more experiences. Maybe it's more bizarre experiences. The flying elephants stay with you forever, but breakfast disappears before lunch. Maybe that's not a problem with memory. Maybe that's memory working exactly as designed, keeping what's interesting, discarding what's not, making space for wonder by forgetting the mundane. What strange thing will you remember from today? Sleep paralysis. You wake up, but your body doesn't. Consciousness returns, but movement remains locked. Your mind is alert, but your muscles are frozen. You try to speak, but no sound comes. Try to move, but nothing responds. You're trapped inside a body that refuses to obey. This is sleep paralysis. When remitonia extends into waking consciousness, when the mechanism that prevents you from acting out dreams continues after dreams end, when the mind wakes up but the body stays asleep, when awareness returns to a prison of flesh, the experience is terrifying. You can see your room, hear sounds, process information, but you can't react, can't escape, can't signal for help. Consciousness without control, awareness without agency, mind without movement, the ultimate powerlessness. Sometimes hallucinations accompany the paralysis. Dark figures in the room, pressure on your chest, sense of evil presence. The brain tries to make sense of the disconnect between alertness and helplessness, creates explanations for inexplicable vulnerability, populates the paralysis with meaning. Different cultures have different names for it. Old hag, pinning, ghost oppression, shadow people, alien abduction. The universality of the experience creates universal mythology. Paralysis becomes supernatural visitation. Medical condition becomes spiritual encounter. But maybe the hallucinations reveal something interesting about consciousness itself. When normal sensory input is limited, the brain fills gaps with imagination. When usual control mechanisms fail, alternative explanations emerge. When reality becomes impossible, unreality feels necessary. The paralysis usually lasts seconds to minutes, feels like hours. Time dilates when you can't move, when breathing feels difficult, when panic builds without physical outlet, when fight or flight activates but fighting and fleeing are impossible. Movement eventually returns, usually gradually, a finger twitch, a toe wiggle, sensation creeping back into frozen limbs. The paralysis dissolves like waking from a deeper dream. Control returns to a body that temporarily abandoned you. Maybe sleep paralysis reveals the complexity of consciousness itself. How many systems must coordinate for normal waking experience? How precarious the sense of unified selfhood really is. How easily the mind-body connection can glitch. Some people experience it once, others regularly. Some learn to recognize it happening and wait calmly for it to pass. Others never get used to the terror. The same phenomenon creates vastly different experiences depending on understanding and expectation. Maybe that's true for all consciousness. The same neural events create different subjective realities. The same brain states feel different depending on interpretation. Maybe sleep paralysis isn't just about paralysis. Maybe it's about the relationship between body and mind, between control and awareness, between being awake and being alive. You eventually move again, but something lingers. A memory of consciousness without command, of mind without muscle, of awareness without agency. A reminder that the self is more fragile than it feels. The Streisand Effect. You try to hide something, make it private, remove it from public view, delete it from the internet, suppress the information, control the narrative. But your attempt to conceal creates the opposite result. The act of hiding makes people look. The effort to suppress generates interest. The desire for privacy creates publicity. This is the Streisand Effect. When attempting to hide information makes it more visible. when censorship creates curiosity, when suppression generates amplification, when the cover-up becomes more interesting than what was being covered up. The name comes from Barbra Streisand's attempt to suppress photographs of her home. She sued to prevent publication. The lawsuit created news. The news created interest. The interest created massive distribution of images that would have been ignored without the legal action. Her privacy effort destroyed her privacy. It happens constantly now. Companies trying to remove embarrassing videos from the internet discover that removal attempts go viral. Politicians denying scandals create bigger scandals. Celebrities demanding privacy generate more attention. The internet interprets censorship as damage and roots around it. Maybe it reveals something about human psychology. Forbidden fruit tastes sweeter. Hidden information seems more valuable. The effort to conceal signals that something is worth finding. Secrecy creates its own form of marketing. Censorship becomes a form of promotion. Or maybe it's about the nature of information itself. In a connected world, perfect suppression is impossible. Every attempt to hide creates traces. Every deletion leaves records. Every cover-up involves more people. Information wants to be free, in the sense that water wants to flow downhill. The Streisand effect can be predicted but rarely prevented. Once information exists, controlling its distribution becomes nearly impossible. The best strategy is often transparency rather than suppression, acknowledgement rather than denial, getting ahead of the story rather than chasing it. But the effect also creates perverse incentives. People manufacture controversies to generate attention, create fake censorship attempts to promote content, engineer Streisand effects to go viral. The phenomenon becomes a tool rather than just an accident. Maybe the real lesson is about the relationship between attention and prohibition. In an attention economy, being ignored is worse than being criticized. Suppression guarantees attention. Censorship ensures distribution. The attempt to hide becomes the reason to look. Sometimes the best way to make something disappear is to let everyone see it. Sometimes the most effective censorship is no censorship at all. Sometimes hiding in plain sight works better than hiding in secret places. The information you tried to suppress is now everywhere. The attempt to conceal has created permanent visibility. The effort to control has generated chaos. Maybe that's not a bug in how information works. Maybe that's a feature. Maybe transparency isn't just morally superior. Maybe it's practically inevitable. Paradoxical undressing. They find the body in the snow, partially clothed, clothes scattered in a trail leading to the final location. It looks like the person got hot, started removing layers, but the temperature was far below freezing. They were dying of hypothermia. Why would someone getting colder take off their clothes? This is paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon in severe hypothermia where dying people feel overwhelmingly hot, remove clothing in freezing temperatures, strip down while freezing to death. The body's final malfunction creates sensations opposite to reality. Cold becomes hot. Freezing becomes burning. Death masks itself as relief. Scientists think they understand the mechanism. As hypothermia progresses, blood vessels that normally constrict to preserve heat suddenly dilate. Warm blood floods the extremities, creates intense sensation of overheating. The person feels like they're burning up when they're actually freezing. The body's last desperate attempt to warm itself feels like dangerous overheating. But the experience remains deeply unsettling. To feel hot while dying of cold. To seek cooling while needing warmth. To trust sensations that are completely wrong. It's a betrayal by the very systems meant to keep you alive. Your own body becomes your enemy in the final moments. Maybe paradoxical undressing reveals something disturbing about all perception. How much you trust internal signals. How rarely you question bodily sensations. How easily the machinery of awareness can malfunction. If dying of cold can feel like burning up, what other sensations might be lies? Think about phantom limbs, depression, anxiety, addiction. All conditions where internal signals contradict external reality, where the body's messages mislead rather than inform, where trusting your feelings leads you astray. Maybe paradoxical undressing is just the most extreme example of a common problem. The phenomenon also appears in other contexts. People on certain drugs report feeling hot while their body temperature drops. Elderly patients remove clothing in cold rooms. Mental illness can create similar disconnects between sensation and reality. The body's thermostat can break in multiple ways. But there's something particularly haunting about paradoxical undressing. The image of someone dying of cold while feeling hot, removing the very protection they desperately need, acting rationally based on false information, making logical decisions from incorrect premises. Maybe it's a metaphor for other forms of self-destruction, pushing away help when you need it most, rejecting support when you're most vulnerable, isolating yourself when connection could save you. Sometimes the things that feel right are exactly wrong. The clothes lie scattered in the snow, evidence of confusion in the final moments, of sensation divorced from reality, of the body's final malfunction masquerading as logic, a reminder that you can't always trust what you feel, that internal signals can be just as wrong as external ones. Maybe that's why community matters, why outside perspective is valuable, why trusting only yourself can be dangerous. When your internal compass starts spinning, you need other people to show you true north before you start undressing in the snow. The Pratfall Effect. She's perfect, flawless presentation. Every answer correct, immaculate appearance, complete competence. You admire her but feel distant. She's too polished, too controlled, too impossibly together. And then she spills coffee on her white shirt. Suddenly she becomes human, relatable, likable. This is the Pratfall Effect. When minor mistakes make competent people more appealing, when flaws enhance rather than diminish attraction, when perfection creates distance while imperfection creates connection, when stumbling makes someone more graceful, not less. The effect only works for people who are already seen as competent. High-performing individuals become more likable after small mistakes, but low-performing people become less likable after the same errors. The Pratfall Effect requires excellence as a baseline, perfection that can afford a stumble. Maybe it reveals something about how social connection works. Perfect people feel intimidating, unreachable. Their competence creates comparison. Their flawlessness highlights your own imperfections. But when they make mistakes, they become accessible. Their humanity shows through their polish. The effect appears everywhere. Politicians become more popular after minor gaffes that humanize them. Celebrities gain fans when they show vulnerability. Teachers become more beloved when they occasionally forget names or make small errors. The mistake creates permission to connect. But the balance is delicate. Too few flaws and people seem inhuman. Too many, and they seem incompetent. The sweet spot is high competence with occasional humanity, excellence seasoned with humility, strength that can acknowledge weakness. Maybe this explains why authenticity feels so valuable, why people crave real interactions, why social media performances often backfire. When everything is curated to perfection, nothing feels genuine. When flaws are airbrushed out, connection becomes impossible. The Pratfall Effect suggests that trust requires vulnerability, that likability demands humanity, that perfection isn't just impossible, it's undesirable, that the goal isn't to eliminate flaws, but to be excellent despite having them. Think about your favorite people. They're probably competent, but not perfect, capable, but not flawless, strong enough to be vulnerable, excellent enough to make mistakes. Their imperfections don't diminish them. They make them more themselves. Maybe the real insight is about self-acceptance, about recognizing that your flaws might be features, that your mistakes might make you more lovable, not less, that trying to be perfect might be preventing real connection. She laughs about the coffee stain, keeps presenting with a stained shirt, acknowledges the mess without letting it derail her competence. Suddenly, she's not just admirable, she's approachable. The pratfall didn't make her less perfect. It made her more human. And maybe that's the most perfect thing of all. Dissociative episodes. You're having a conversation but watching yourself have it. Sitting in a meeting but observing from the ceiling. Living your life but feeling like a spectator. Your voice sounds foreign. Your actions feel automatic. Your thoughts seem to belong to someone else. You're present but not present. Participating but not inhabiting. This is dissociation. When consciousness detaches from experience. When awareness becomes a witness rather than a participant. When the self splits into observer and observed. When you become a stranger to your own existence. It can happen gradually. A slow fade from embodied experience. A gentle drift from immediate presence. Like consciousness dissolving into mist. Like awareness becoming translucent. Like the self becoming see-through. Or, it can happen suddenly. A sharp disconnection from reality. An abrupt exit from embodied existence. Like consciousness being unplugged. Like awareness being muted. Like someone turned down the volume on your own life. During dissociation, everything feels unreal. Dreamlike. Two-dimensional. Colors seem faded. Sounds feel distant. Touch becomes numb. The world takes on the quality of a movie you're watching rather than a life you're living. Even your own thoughts feel like someone else's dialogue. Maybe dissociation is the mind circuit breaker. When experience becomes too intense, consciousness steps back to protect itself. When reality becomes unbearable, awareness creates distance. When being present hurts too much, the self finds somewhere else to be. Some people dissociate during trauma, others during extreme stress. Some when overwhelmed by emotion, others when underwhelmed by meaning. The trigger varies, but the experience is similar. A withdrawal from immediate existence, a retreat into observational mode. But dissociation isn't always protective. Sometimes it happens when you need to be most present, during important conversations, in crucial moments. When connection matters most, the mechanism meant to protect can become a prison of detachment. Recovery involves reconnecting with embodied experience, grounding techniques that bring consciousness back into the body, mindfulness practices that restore presence, therapy that rebuilds the bridge between observer and participant, slowly learning to inhabit your own life again. Maybe everyone dissociates sometimes, in boring meetings, during routine tasks, while stuck in traffic, small exits from immediate experience, brief vacations from embodied existence. The difference might be degree rather than kind. But chronic dissociation reveals something unsettling about consciousness itself. How easily awareness can detach from experience. How fragile the sense of unified selfhood really is. How much mental energy goes into maintaining the feeling of being present in your own life. You eventually return to full embodiment. Presence gradually restores itself, but something lingers, a memory of being absent from yourself, of watching your own life from outside, a reminder that consciousness is more fluid than it feels, more optional than it seems. Maybe that's both terrifying and liberating. The self is less solid than it appears, but maybe that means it's also more adaptable, more resilient, more capable of healing than rigid selfhood would allow. The Benjamin Franklin Effect. You ask your enemy for a small favor, nothing significant, just borrowing a book. They agree reluctantly, hand it over with obvious irritation, but something changes in their attitude. The hostility softens slightly. The next interaction is less tense. The favor has created unexpected warmth. This is the Benjamin Franklin Effect. When doing someone a favor makes you like them more, not less. When helping creates affection rather than resentment. When small acts of service generate unexpected fondness. When the person who benefits isn't the only one changed by kindness. Franklin discovered it accidentally. He had a political enemy who constantly opposed him. Instead of fighting back, Franklin asked to borrow a rare book from the man's library. The enemy complied. But afterward, he became friendlier, more cooperative. Eventually, they became allies. The effect seems backwards. Logic suggests that receiving favors should create gratitude while giving them should create resentment. But psychology works differently. When you do someone a favor, you unconsciously justify the action. Why would you help someone you dislike? You must like them more than you thought. The mind works to maintain internal consistency. If you act kindly toward someone, you must have kind feelings toward them. If you help someone, you must care about them. The behavior changes the attitude, not the other way around. Actions create feelings as much as feelings create actions. Maybe this reveals something profound about how relationships actually develop. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through small interactions that accumulate over time, through tiny favors that shift perspectives, through minor kindnesses that create major connections. The effect works both ways. When someone does you a favor, they become more invested in your success. When you do someone a favor, you become more invested in theirs. The exchange creates mutual investment, reciprocal caring, shared interest in each other's welfare. But the favor must be small. Large requests create resentment rather than affection. The sweet spot is something minor enough to be granted easily, but significant enough to require conscious choice. Something that takes effort but not sacrifice. Something that says, I trust you without saying, I need you. Maybe the Benjamin Franklin effect explains why asking for help can strengthen relationships, why vulnerability creates connection, why showing need can generate care rather than burden. The person who helps becomes more invested in your success, not less. Think about the people you've helped. Do you feel warmer toward them? More protective? More interested in their welfare? Maybe helping others doesn't just benefit them. Maybe it benefits you by creating emotional investment, by making their success feel like your success. The enemy becomes an ally through the simple act of lending a book. The favor changes both people. One receives help. The other receives a reason to care. Both receive a relationship that didn't exist before. Maybe that's how most friendships actually begin. Not with compatibility, but with small acts of mutual service. Shower thoughts. The water flows over your shoulders. Warm, steady, hypnotic. Your mind begins to wander. Away from the soap. Away from the routine. Away from the bathroom entirely. And then it arrives. The perfect solution. The brilliant insight. The idea you've been searching for. Why do insights come in the shower? Why does hot water trigger creativity? Why do breakthrough moments happen when you're naked and wet and completely removed from the problem you were trying to solve? Maybe it's about relaxation. The shower is one of the few places in modern life where multitasking is impossible, where phones can't reach you, where interruption can't find you, where your mind finally gets permission to stop trying and start wandering. Maybe it's about routine. Washing your body requires no conscious thought. The process runs on autopilot while consciousness is free to roam. Without specific tasks to focus on, the mind can make unexpected connections, can combine ideas in novel ways, can solve problems by not trying to solve them. Maybe it's about the warm water itself. Heat relaxes muscles and maybe minds. The physical comfort creates mental comfort. The body's ease creates cognitive ease. When you're physically comfortable, maybe mental breakthroughs become more likely. Or maybe it's about the white noise. The sound of water blocks other distractions, creates an audio cocoon, masks the mental chatter that usually fills consciousness. In the relative silence, quieter thoughts can finally be heard. Subtler insights can finally emerge. Some neuroscientists think it's about the default mode network, the brain system that activates during rest. During shower time, focused attention relaxes and the default mode takes over, starts making broader connections, starts seeing bigger pictures, starts finding solutions that focused thinking missed. Maybe shower thoughts reveal something important about how creativity actually works. not through intense focus, but through gentle attention. Not by trying harder, but by trying differently. Not by forcing solutions, but by creating conditions where solutions can emerge naturally. The effect isn't limited to showers. It happens during walks, while driving, during meditation, anytime attention softens without disappearing entirely, anytime the mind gets to operate in the space between focus and daydreaming, between effort and ease. Maybe that's why so many cultures have rituals around bathing, why hot springs have always been places of healing, why water has symbolic connections to purification and rebirth. Maybe the shower isn't just cleaning your body, maybe it's also cleaning your mind, making space for new thoughts by washing away old preoccupations. The insight comes fully formed, perfect, obvious in retrospect. You want to remember it, but your hands are full of shampoo. You want to write it down, but there's no paper in the shower. The brilliance arrives at the moment when capturing it is impossible. Maybe that's part of the magic. Maybe shower thoughts are meant to be experienced rather than recorded. Maybe they're gifts from the unconscious mind that can't be preserved, only received. Maybe the real insight isn't the specific idea, but the reminder that your best thinking happens when you stop thinking so hard. The Dunning-Kruger Effect. You learn the basics of something new. Photography, cooking, psychology. After a few hours of study, you feel confident. After a day of practice, you feel competent. After a week of experience, you feel like an expert. You start giving advice, correcting others, sharing your wisdom with people who've been practicing for years. This is the Dunning-Kruger Effect, when knowing a little makes you feel like you know a lot, when small amounts of knowledge create large amounts of confidence, when incompetence creates the illusion of competence, when you don't know enough to know how much you don't know. The effect creates a cruel irony. The more someone lacks skill, the more confident they feel about their abilities. The less they know, the more certain they become. The worse they are, the better they think they are. Incompetence breeds overconfidence while expertise breeds doubt. It happens because skill has two components, actual ability and the ability to recognize ability. Incompetent people lack both. They can't perform well and they can't recognize good performance. They mistake their poor efforts for adequate ones, their failures for successes, their ignorance for knowledge. Meanwhile, truly skilled people suffer from the opposite problem. They know enough to recognize their limitations. They see the complexity they haven't mastered. They understand the subtleties they haven't grasped. Their knowledge makes them humble rather than confident. Maybe this explains why comment sections are filled with certainty, while expert papers are filled with hedging. Why social media debates are so polarized while academic discussions are so nuanced. Why the loudest voices often have the least knowledge. Why confidence inversely correlates with competence. The effect appears everywhere. Incompetent drivers think they're above average. Poor students overestimate their performance. Unskilled workers believe they deserve promotion. People with minimal medical knowledge diagnose complex conditions. A little learning becomes a dangerous thing. But maybe there's value in beginner's confidence. Maybe initial overestimation helps people persist through difficult learning phases. Maybe false confidence provides the motivation needed to develop real competence. Maybe the Dunning-Kruger effect is a feature rather than a bug. The danger comes when confidence prevents learning, when people stop seeking feedback because they think they've already mastered the skill, when overestimation becomes permanent rather than temporary, when the effect creates experts rather than students. True expertise brings humility, not because skilled people lack confidence, but because they understand complexity. They know what they don't know. They recognize the limits of their knowledge. They see the mountain of understanding that still needs to be climbed. Maybe the antidote to Dunning-Kruger isn't more knowledge, but more accurate self-assessment. Learning to calibrate confidence with competence. Developing the ability to recognize what you don't recognize. Understanding that the more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn. The real expert says, I don't know more often than the beginner, not because they know less, but because they know better. They understand that knowledge has depths they haven't plumbed, that mastery reveals complexity rather than simplicity, that true wisdom begins with admitting ignorance. Maybe that's the real lesson of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Not that incompetent people are overconfident, but that confidence should decrease as knowledge increases, that certainty should shrink as understanding grows, that the wisest people are those who know they still have everything to learn. Hypnic jerks. You're drifting towards sleep, consciousness fading, the day dissolving into dreams. Your body relaxes completely, and then suddenly you're falling, plummeting through empty space. Your leg kicks violently, your body jolts awake, heart pounding, adrenaline flooding, completely alert again. This is a hypnic jerk, also called a sleep start, the violent muscle spasm that yanks you back from the edge of sleep, the body's mysterious decision to simulate falling just as you're about to rest, the sudden conviction that you're in mortal danger when you're lying safely in bed. Scientists have theories, but no definitive answers. Maybe it's an evolutionary leftover, an ancient alarm system that prevented our ancestors from falling out of trees while sleeping. The brain misinterprets the relaxation of sleep as the sensation of falling and triggers an emergency response. Maybe it's about brain chemistry. As consciousness fades, different neural systems switch off at different rates. The motor system might misfire during the transition, create random muscle contractions, generate false signals of movement, produce phantom sensations of falling. Or maybe it's about control, the conscious mind letting go while the unconscious takes over. The transition between waking and sleeping isn't always smooth. Sometimes there's interference, static, crossed wires. The hypnic jerk might be consciousness' last attempt to maintain control. The experience varies dramatically. Sometimes it's a gentle twitch, sometimes a violent convulsion, sometimes accompanied by vivid falling sensations, sometimes by flashes of light or loud sounds. Sometimes you dream of tripping or stepping off a curb. Your brain creates a narrative to explain the inexplicable jolt. Some people experience hypnic jerks regularly, others rarely or never. Stress makes them more likely. So does caffeine. Irregular sleep schedules, uncomfortable sleeping positions, as if the body becomes more vigilant when it doesn't trust the environment to be safe for sleep. But hypnic jerks can also happen during relaxation, meditation, yoga, massage. Anytime the body moves from tension to deep relaxation, as if letting go completely triggers some ancient warning system, some primitive fear of dissolving into unconsciousness. Maybe the hypnic jerk reveals something about the nature of sleep itself, how dramatic the transition really is, how much trust it requires to let consciousness fade, how vulnerable the process makes you. Sleep is a kind of temporary death, a nightly rehearsal for the final letting go. The jerk passes, heart rate settles, breathing normalizes. You try to fall asleep again, but something lingers, a reminder that even rest requires courage, that sleep is an act of faith, that consciousness doesn't surrender easily to unconsciousness. Maybe hypnic jerks aren't malfunctions. Maybe they're reminders, evidence that your nervous system is working exactly as designed, protective even in sleep, vigilant even in rest, ready to pull you back from any edge, real or imagined. You eventually drift off successfully. The hypnic jerk becomes a fading memory, but your body remains on watch, ready to jolt you awake if falling becomes real rather than metaphorical, ready to choose alertness over rest if survival demands it. Sleep comes with its own kind of courage, the willingness to let go completely, to trust that you'll return, to accept that consciousness is more fragile than it feels, more temporary than it seems, more precious because it can be lost. The Uncanny Valley. The robot looks almost human, but not quite. The features are correct, but somehow wrong. The proportions accurate but unsettling. The more realistic it becomes, the more disturbing it feels. Perfect mimicry creates perfect revulsion. The closer to human, the further from acceptance. This is the uncanny valley, the dip in affinity that occurs when artificial beings become almost but not quite human, when similarity breeds discomfort rather than connection, when realism creates revulsion, when getting closer to perfection makes everything feel more wrong. The effect appears everywhere now. Computer-generated characters in movies, video game avatars, humanoid robots, deepfake videos. The more sophisticated the technology becomes, the more unsettling the results feel. Progress in realism creates progress in unease. Maybe it's evolutionary, a warning system against disease or death. Corpses look almost human, but not quite. Sick people have subtle wrongness in their appearance. The uncanny valley might be your brain's way of detecting threats that look like opportunities, safety mechanisms disguised as aesthetic preferences. Or maybe it's about expectation. When something looks human, you expect human behavior, human warmth, human unpredictability. When it acts mechanical instead, the disappointment feels like betrayal. The gap between appearance and reality creates cognitive dissonance. The mind rejects what doesn't match its predictions. The valley has measurable depths. Cartoon characters feel fine because they're obviously artificial. Realistic robots feel fine because they're obviously mechanical. But the space between artificial and real, between mechanical and human, creates maximum discomfort. The worst place to be is almost convincing. Maybe this explains why masks are unsettling, why mannequins feel creepy, why dolls disturb some people, why certain portraits seem to stare too intently, why some smiles look wrong even when the features are correct. The uncanny valley isn't just about robots, it's about anything that mimics humanity imperfectly. But the valley shifts as technology improves. What felt realistic 10 years ago now looks obviously fake. What creates uncanny feelings today might feel normal tomorrow. Maybe the valley isn't fixed. Maybe it's a moving target, a gap between current capability and perfect simulation. Some artists deliberately seek the uncanny valley, use it to create unease, to question what makes something human, to explore the boundaries between real and artificial, to make people uncomfortable with their own assumptions about humanity itself. Maybe the uncanny valley reveals something profound about how you recognize other humans. It's not just about features or proportions, it's about subtle movements, micro-expressions, the ineffable quality of consciousness behind the eyes, the thing that makes someone feel present rather than simulated. As artificial intelligence advances, the uncanny valley might become more than aesthetic preference. It might become existential question. If something acts perfectly human, speaks perfectly human, responds perfectly human, but isn't human, does the valley still matter? Does the feeling of wrongness have meaning beyond evolutionary bias? The robot's eyes are too perfect, the skin too flawless, the smile too consistent. Every detail correct, but the whole somehow wrong. You can't explain why it disturbs you, can't articulate what's missing, but something essential is absent, something that makes humanity human rather than just human-shaped. Maybe that's the real message of the uncanny valley. Not that artificial beings are inferior, but that human beings are mysterious, that consciousness has qualities that can't be reproduced, that there's something irreducible about being genuinely alive rather than convincingly simulated. The valley exists because you can sense the difference, because authenticity has a feeling that mimicry can't capture, because being human involves more than looking human. And maybe, as technology advances, the uncanny valley will help preserve something essential about what makes you genuinely, irreplaceably, mysteriously human. Collective effervescence. The concert reaches its peak. 20,000 people singing the same words, moving to the same rhythm, feeling the same emotions. Individual consciousness dissolves into something larger. You're no longer yourself. You're part of a collective soul, a shared being made of music and emotion and synchronized hearts. This is collective effervescence. When groups experience identical emotions simultaneously, when individual feelings merge into collective feeling, when separate consciousnesses temporarily become one consciousness, when the whole becomes greater than the sum of its psychological parts. It happens at concerts, sporting events, religious gatherings, political rallies, protests, celebrations. Anytime people come together around shared meaning and synchronized attention, the boundaries between self and other start to blur. Individual identity softens into group identity. Maybe it's evolutionary. Humans survived by cooperating, by feeling connected to their tribe, by sacrificing individual interests for collective benefit. Collective effervescence might be the mechanism that made civilization possible, the psychological glue that holds societies together. The experience feels transcendent, spiritual, like touching something divine, like glimpsing the underlying unity of all existence, like discovering that separation is illusion and connection is reality. Religious traditions have always recognized and cultivated these states, built rituals around them, created institutions to preserve them. But collective effervescence can also be dangerous. It can override individual judgment, make people do things they wouldn't do alone, create mob mentality, generate fanaticism. The same mechanism that creates beautiful unity can create destructive conformity. The loss of individual consciousness isn't always beneficial. Maybe the key is awareness, recognizing when you're experiencing collective effervescence, appreciating the beauty while maintaining critical thinking, enjoying the connection while preserving independence, using the experience to feel human unity without losing human individuality. Think about your most powerful group experiences. Concerts where you sang until your voice gave out, games where you cheered until you couldn't speak, ceremonies where you cried along with strangers, moments when you felt part of something infinitely larger than yourself, when individual consciousness dissolved into collective joy. Maybe collective effervescence reveals something essential about human nature, that despite all the emphasis on individualism, you're fundamentally social beings, that your deepest experiences involve connection rather than separation, that consciousness might be more collective than individual. The music ends. The crowd disperses. Individual awareness returns, but something lingers. A memory of unity, a taste of transcendence, a reminder that consciousness has collective dimensions, that you're not just isolated minds in separate bodies, but parts of larger patterns of awareness. Maybe that's why people seek these experiences, why concerts and rallies and religious services continue to matter in a digital age, why virtual connection can't fully replace physical gathering, why shared presence creates something that shared information cannot. The individual self returns but changed, enlarged by the experience of dissolution, enriched by the memory of unity, reminded that consciousness has depths beyond personal awareness, that being human involves both individuality and collectivity, both separation and connection, both self and other. The generation effect. You read the definition of a word. Later you can't remember it. You create your own definition. Later you remember it perfectly. You copy notes from a lecture. They vanish from memory. You take notes in your own words. They stick forever. The act of generating information makes it yours in a way that receiving it never can. This is the generation effect, when self-produced information becomes more memorable than externally provided information, when creation enhances memory more than consumption, when the effort of making something makes it unforgettable, when mental work creates mental ownership. The effect appears in many forms. Students remember concepts better when they have to explain them. Writers remember their own words better than others' words. Problem solvers remember solutions they discovered better than solutions they were told. The act of generation creates deeper encoding, stronger neural pathways, more durable memories. Maybe it's about effort. Things that require work feel more valuable. Information you have to struggle for seems more important than information that comes easily. The brain assigns significance based on investment. treats effortful knowledge as precious knowledge. Or maybe it's about connection. When you generate information, you connect it to what you already know, link it to existing memories, integrate it into your personal knowledge network. Received information remains isolated. Generated information becomes integrated. The effect suggests that passive learning is inferior to active learning, that reading is less effective than writing, that listening is less powerful than speaking, that receiving knowledge is less valuable than creating knowledge. Education becomes about generation rather than consumption. But generation requires existing knowledge. You can't create from nothing. The effect works best when you already know something about the topic, when you have foundation to build on, when generation feels like extension rather than invention. The sweet spot is guided creation rather than pure creation. Maybe the generation effect explains why teaching makes you learn, why explaining concepts deepens understanding, why mentoring benefits the mentor as much as the student. When you generate explanations for others, you generate understanding for yourself. Think about your most memorable learning experiences. They probably involve doing rather than receiving, creating rather than consuming, generating answers rather than memorizing them. The knowledge that sticks is the knowledge you made rather than the knowledge you borrowed. The effect also appears in problem solving. Solutions you discover feel more satisfying than solutions you're given. They make more sense, feel more true, last longer in memory. The journey to the answer becomes part of the answer itself. The struggle creates the meaning. Maybe this reveals something about how minds actually work, not as storage devices but as meaning-making machines, not as repositories but as generators, not as libraries but as laboratories. Memory serves creation more than preservation. Understanding serves generation more than reception. Your own thoughts feel more real than other people's thoughts. Your own insights feel more valuable than borrowed wisdom. Your own creations feel more meaningful than inherited knowledge. Maybe that's not selfishness. Maybe that's how learning actually works, through generation rather than absorption, through creation rather than consumption. The word you defined yourself becomes part of your vocabulary forever. The one you looked up disappears by morning. The generation effect isn't just about memory. It's about ownership, about making external knowledge internal, about transforming information into understanding, about becoming the author of your own mind. Chronostasis. You glance at the clock. The second hand seems frozen, stuck between two positions. Time has stopped, but only for a moment. Then it starts moving again at normal speed. The pause wasn't real, but it felt absolutely real. Time stuttered just long enough for you to notice its stuttering. This is chronostasis, the stopped clock illusion. When rapid eye movements create the perception that time has paused. When your brain backfills visual information to create seamless perception. When the gap between what you see and when you see it becomes briefly visible. It happens during saccades, the quick eye movements that redirect your gaze. During saccades, vision is temporarily suppressed. Your brain can't process visual information while your eyes are moving, but you don't experience blindness. Your brain fills in the gap, extends the first stable image backward in time to cover the movement period. The result is temporal illusion. The clock appears to stay still longer than it actually does. The first moment of looking extends backward to eliminate the gap created by eye movement. Your brain edits reality to maintain the illusion of continuous vision, creates false duration to prevent perceived blindness. Maybe chronostasis reveals something disturbing about perception itself. How much of what you see is actually construction rather than detection? How much your brain edits reality without your knowledge? How much of consciousness is artistic interpretation rather than accurate recording? The effect isn't limited to clocks. It happens with any target of rapid eye movement. Digital displays, moving objects, other people's faces. Anytime your eyes jump to a new location, the first moment gets extended backward. Time distorts to preserve the illusion of seamless awareness. But why does the brain do this? Why not simply accept the gaps? Why work so hard to maintain the illusion of continuous vision? Maybe because consciousness can't tolerate discontinuity, can't admit that perception is choppy rather than smooth, can't acknowledge that awareness has blind spots. Think about blinking. You don't see darkness during blinks. Your brain edits out the interruptions, creates the illusion of uninterrupted vision even though your eyes are closed dozens of times per minute. Maybe chronostasis is similar, a way of maintaining the fiction that consciousness is seamless when it's actually full of gaps. The stopped clock effect suggests that time perception is more constructed than experienced, that duration is actively created rather than passively measured, that your brain is constantly editing temporal experience to create coherent narrative, that time is as much interpretation as measurement. Maybe this explains why time feels fluid during altered states, why meditation can slow subjective time, why psychedelics can make moments feel eternal, why extreme situations create time dilation. If time perception is constructed, then changing the construction changes the experience. The clock starts moving again. Time resumes its normal pace, but something has been revealed. The gap between perception and reality. The work that consciousness does to maintain its own illusions. The fragility of temporal experience. The editing that happens beneath awareness. Maybe chronostasis isn't a glitch. Maybe it's a feature. Evidence that consciousness prioritizes coherence over accuracy, meaning over measurement. Seamless experience over technical precision. Maybe the stopped clock shows how hard your brain works to give you a world that makes sense, even when sense requires a little creative editing of time itself. The spacing effect. You study intensively for 3 hours. Cram all the information into one session. Master the material completely, then forget most of it within a week. But if you study the same material for 20 minutes a day across 9 days, it stays with you for months. Less total effort, better long-term retention. Time distributed beats time concentrated. This is the spacing effect, also called distributed practice. When spreading learning over time creates stronger memories than massing learning into single sessions. When intervals enhance retention more than intensity. When forgetting between sessions actually strengthens long-term memory. The effect seems counterintuitive. Logic suggests that concentrated effort should produce concentrated results, that cramming should create dense, durable knowledge. But memory works differently. It prefers repetition over intensity, spacing over massing, time over effort. Maybe it's about retrieval practice. When you return to material after a delay, you have to work harder to remember it. The effort of retrieval strengthens the memory trace, makes it more accessible next time. Each spaced repetition creates deeper encoding, stronger neural pathways. Or maybe it's about interference. When you mass practice, later repetitions compete with earlier ones. Information gets tangled, confused. But when you space practice, each repetition stands alone, gets processed independently, creates distinct memory traces rather than muddled ones. The spacing effect appears everywhere. Musicians practice pieces across weeks rather than hours. Athletes train skills across seasons rather than days. Students learn languages through daily practice rather than weekend intensives. The pattern holds across domains. Spacing enhances learning regardless of content. But optimal spacing is tricky. Too close together and you don't get the retrieval benefit. Too far apart and you forget everything between sessions. The sweet spot is just as you're about to forget, right before the memory would fade completely. The edge of forgetting becomes the moment of strengthening. Maybe the spacing effect reveals something profound about how memory actually works. Not as storage, but as reconstruction. Not as filing, but as rebuilding. Every time you remember something, you rebuild it from fragments. The reconstruction process strengthens the fragments, makes them more available for future rebuilding. Think about your strongest memories. They're probably not from single intense experiences, but from repeated spaced ones. Daily routines, weekly rituals, annual traditions. The memories that last are the ones that return regularly, that get reconstructed repeatedly, that benefit from the spacing effect. Educational systems often ignore this. Organize learning into intensive blocks rather than distributed practice, semester-long courses rather than year-long spirals, final exams rather than spaced testing. The structure fights against how memory actually works, creates cramming rather than retention. Maybe the real insight is about patience, about trusting that time enhances learning rather than hurrying it, about accepting that forgetting is part of remembering, that the gaps between practice sessions aren't empty, they're working, processing, strengthening, preparing the memory for permanent storage. The material you crammed disappears quickly, but the material you spaced stays with you for years. Less effort in the moment, more retention over time. The spacing effect isn't just about memory, it's about the difference between performance and learning, between temporary knowing and permanent understanding. Mirror touch synesthesia. You watch someone get a paper cut, your finger stings. You see someone being hugged, your body feels embraced. You observe a massage, your muscles relax. You witness pain and feel pain. You see pleasure and experience pleasure. Other people's sensations become your sensations. The boundaries between self and other dissolve at the level of physical feeling. This is mirror touch synesthesia. When observing touch creates the experience of being touched. When watching physical sensations generates matching physical sensations. When the nervous system treats observed experience as personal experience. When empathy becomes literally embodied. It's more than imagination, more than sympathy. The sensations are real, precise, located in specific body parts. When you see someone's left hand being touched, your left hand feels touched. The mapping is exact. The experience is automatic, involuntary, immediate. Maybe it's about mirror neurons taken to an extreme, the brain cells that fire both when you act and when you observe others acting. In mirror touch synesthesia, the mirroring extends beyond intention to sensation, beyond action to experience, beyond thought to feeling. The condition creates both gifts and burdens, enhanced empathy but overwhelming sensitivity, deeper connection but blurred boundaries, understanding others' experiences but struggling to distinguish them from your own. The capacity for profound compassion coupled with the challenge of self-protection. Maybe mirror touch synesthesia reveals something about how all empathy works, how understanding others requires some form of embodied simulation, how putting yourself in someone else's shoes might be literally neurological rather than metaphorical, how compassion involves the nervous system, not just the mind. Think about your own empathic responses. Do you sometimes feel tension when watching someone struggle? Relaxation when seeing someone comfortable? Pain when witnessing injury? Maybe everyone has traces of mirror touch experience. Maybe synesthesia is just the extreme end of a normal spectrum. The condition also raises questions about the boundaries of self. If you feel what others feel, where do you end and they begin? If observed experiences become personal experiences, what defines individual consciousness? Mirror touch synesthesia suggests that the self might be more porous than it appears. Some people with mirror touch synesthesia become healers, massage therapists, counselors, doctors. They use their embodied empathy to understand what others need, to provide comfort that addresses actual rather than imagined discomfort. Their unusual neurology becomes a form of practical wisdom. But the condition can also be overwhelming. Crowded places become assault courses of unwanted sensations. Movies become endurance tests of borrowed pain. Human interaction requires constant boundary management. The gift of enhanced empathy comes with the cost of reduced self-protection. Maybe mirror touch synesthesia shows the true nature of human connection. That separation is partly illusion, that consciousness might be more shared than individual, that the boundaries between bodies might be more fluid than skin suggests. That feeling what others feel isn't dysfunction but deep function. You watch someone stretch and feel your own muscles lengthening. You see someone shiver and feel cold creeping across your skin. You observe someone being comforted and feel warmth spreading through your chest. For a moment, the distance between self and other disappears. Touch becomes universal. Sensation becomes shared. Maybe that's not synesthesia. Maybe that's humanity functioning at its highest level. Maybe the ability to feel what others feel isn't a glitch in the nervous system. Maybe it's consciousness remembering what it was meant to be. Connected rather than isolated. Shared rather than separate. One body with many faces rather than many bodies pretending to be alone. The testing effect. You read the chapter 3 times. Highlight the important parts. Make detailed notes. Feel confident about your knowledge. Then take a practice test. Discover you remember almost nothing. Reading felt like learning, but testing revealed the truth. Exposure isn't the same as retention. Familiarity isn't the same as knowledge. This is the testing effect. When retrieving information from memory strengthens it more than reviewing information does. When the act of remembering makes memories stronger rather than just accessing them. When testing yourself teaches you more than teaching yourself. When questions enhance learning more than answers. The effect seems backwards. Logic suggests that studying should create knowledge, while testing should only measure it, but memory works differently. The struggle to retrieve information strengthens neural pathways. The effort to remember makes information more memorable. Testing becomes learning rather than just evaluation. Maybe it's about desirable difficulties. When information comes easily, the brain doesn't work hard to encode it, but when retrieval requires effort, the brain treats the information as important, strengthens the connections, makes future retrieval easier. Difficulty in the moment creates ease in the future. Think about recognition versus recall. Multiple choice questions feel easier because you recognize the right answer among options. But free recall questions require more effort. You have to generate the answer from memory. The extra effort creates stronger learning. Better long-term retention. The testing effect appears in many forms. Flashcards that require active recall beat, highlighting that only requires recognition. Practice tests that demand retrieval beat study guides that provide information. Self-quizzing that forces memory work beats, rereading that feels like memory work. But the effect depends on successful retrieval. Testing only helps if you can actually remember the information. If recall fails completely, the testing creates frustration rather than learning. The sweet spot is partial success. Struggle that leads to remembering rather than struggle that leads to forgetting. Maybe this explains why teaching helps you learn. When you explain something to others, you test your own understanding, force retrieval of information, discover gaps in knowledge, strengthen what you know and identify what you don't. Teaching becomes, testing becomes learning. Educational systems are slowly recognizing this, moving from content delivery to retrieval practice, from information provision to memory testing, from teaching answers to asking questions. The shift recognizes that learning happens during recall, not during exposure. The testing effect also suggests that forgetting is part of learning rather than opposed to it. When you forget information and then retrieve it, the memory becomes stronger than if you had never forgotten it. The cycle of forgetting and remembering creates more durable knowledge than constant review. Maybe the real insight is about active versus passive learning. Reading feels productive, but mostly creates familiarity. Testing feels difficult, but actually creates knowledge. The activities that feel like learning often aren't. The activities that feel like evaluation often are. Your highlighted notes fade from memory within days. But the practice test questions stick for weeks. The information you struggled to retrieve becomes the information you can't forget. The testing effect isn't just about education, it's about the difference between exposure and encoding, between familiarity and knowledge, between feeling like you know and actually knowing. Prosopagnosia moments. You walk past your neighbor in the grocery store. Make eye contact. Smile politely. Keep walking. Only later do you realize it was your neighbor of 5 years. The face was familiar but unrecognizable. The context was wrong. The lighting was different. The usual recognition failed completely. This is a prosopagnosia moment, when face recognition temporarily breaks down, when familiar faces become foreign, when the neural machinery that processes faces glitches, when someone you know well becomes someone you've never seen before, face blindness striking even people with normal face recognition. Most people experience this occasionally, seeing teachers outside school, coworkers outside work, neighbors outside neighborhood. The face processing system relies heavily on context. When context changes, recognition can fail. The same face in a different setting becomes a different face. Maybe it reveals how much face recognition depends on expectation. You expect to see certain faces in certain places. Your brain uses context to narrow the possibilities, to make recognition easier. When someone appears where they don't belong, the system struggles. Context mismatch creates recognition failure. But true prosopagnosia is more severe, permanent, rather than temporary. Some people can't recognize faces at all, not even their own family members, not their own reflection. They navigate social situations through voice recognition, clothing cues, behavioral patterns, everything except the face itself. For them, everyone is a stranger until they speak, until they reveal identity through non-facial means. Social interactions become detective work, gathering clues to identify who they're talking to. The effortless recognition most people take for granted becomes conscious effort. Maybe prosopagnosia moments help understand how face recognition actually works for everyone, how automatic it usually is, how much social interaction depends on instant identification, how much cognitive effort goes into processing faces, even when the process feels effortless. Think about your own recognition failures. The person who looked familiar but you couldn't place. The face you knew but couldn't identify. The awkward moment of pretending to recognize someone while frantically searching memory for their identity. Everyone becomes temporarily face blind sometimes. The condition also raises questions about identity itself. If you can't recognize faces, how do you maintain relationships? How do you distinguish between strangers and friends? How does social connection work when visual recognition fails? Maybe identity is more than appearance. Maybe connection transcends recognition. Some people with prosopagnosia develop enhanced abilities in other areas, better voice recognition, improved attention to mannerisms, stronger memory for personal details. The loss of face processing creates gains in other processing. The brain compensates for deficits by strengthening alternatives. Your neighbor's face finally clicks into place. Recognition returns. Familiarity floods back. You feel foolish for not recognizing someone so familiar. But maybe the moment reveals something valuable. How much you depend on face recognition. How fragile the process really is. How effortful the effortless actually is. The next time recognition fails, maybe it's not failure at all. Maybe it's a glimpse into how complex social cognition really is. How many systems must coordinate for simple recognition? How remarkable it is that faces usually make sense. How much neural machinery works invisibly to make social interaction possible. Maybe prosopagnosia moments are reminders that every face is a mystery being solved. That recognition is achievement rather than given. That seeing someone as familiar rather than foreign requires sophisticated neural computation happening below awareness. That knowing a face is more complicated than it feels. The isolation effect. Your teacher writes 20 words on the board, 19 in black ink, 1 in red. Later you remember the red word perfectly, but forget most of the black ones. The isolated item stands out in memory. The different becomes memorable. The exception proves the rule by being the only thing you remember. This is the isolation effect, also called the von Restorff effect, when distinctive items become more memorable than common ones, when difference creates salience, when standing out leads to sticking around. When uniqueness enhances memory formation and retrieval, the effect works across modalities. Visual differences like color or size, auditory differences like volume or pitch, temporal differences like timing or duration, conceptual differences like category or meaning. The brain treats distinctiveness as importance, marks unusual items for special attention. Maybe it's evolutionary. Unusual things might signal danger or opportunity. Changes in the environment require immediate attention. Differences from expected patterns need to be remembered. The isolation effect might be consciousness prioritizing what's potentially significant. But the effect can be manipulated. Advertisers use it constantly. The one colorful product among gray competitors. The single loud voice in quiet conversation. The unusual font in standard text. They know that isolation creates attention, and attention creates memory. Students use it too, highlighting key concepts in bright colors, writing important notes in different handwriting, creating visual breaks in dense text, making crucial information stand out from background information. Isolation becomes a learning strategy rather than just a memory quirk. The effect appears in social situations. The person dressed differently at a formal event, the only child among adults, the single dissenting voice in group consensus. Isolation creates memorability in human interactions just as it does in information processing. Maybe the isolation effect reveals something about how attention actually works. Not as a spotlight that illuminates everything equally, but as a filter that prioritizes the unusual. Not as passive reception, but as active selection. Not as democratic awareness, but as preferential processing. Think about your most vivid memories. They're probably not from typical days, but from unusual ones. Not from normal experiences, but from distinctive ones. Not from routine interactions, but from exceptional ones. Memory collects rarities rather than regularities. But isolation requires context. Something can only stand out against a background of similarity. The red word is only distinctive because the others are black. Uniqueness is relational rather than absolute. Depends on what it's being compared to rather than what it is intrinsically. The isolation effect suggests that forgetting might be as important as remembering. By forgetting the routine, memory makes room for the remarkable. By ignoring the common, attention can focus on the critical. By discarding the similar, consciousness can preserve the significant. Maybe this explains why life feels more memorable during periods of change. Why travel creates more vivid memories than routine. Why new experiences stick better than repeated ones. Change creates isolation. Isolation creates memorability. Memorability creates the sense that life is worth living. Your memory of the lesson fades, but the red word remains. Clear, bright, isolated from the background of forgotten information. The isolation effect isn't just about memory formation, it's about meaning creation, about what consciousness chooses to preserve from the stream of experience, about the difference between what happens and what matters. Lucid dreaming glitches. You realize you're dreaming. The awareness changes everything. You can fly, control the environment, transform the narrative, become the director of your own unconscious movie. But sometimes the control slips. Dream logic bleeds into waking thought. The boundaries between sleep and consciousness blur in unexpected ways. This is lucid dreaming glitching, when dream awareness creates strange side effects. When conscious control over unconscious processes produces unexpected results. When the boundary between sleeping and waking becomes permeable rather than absolute. Sometimes dream powers leak into waking life. You try to fly upon waking. Attempt to change reality through will alone. Expect dream logic to work in physical world. The transition from dream control to real limitation creates momentary confusion. Brief attempts to maintain abilities that only exist in sleep. Sometimes waking logic intrudes into dreams, mathematical reasoning in fantasy scenarios, scientific skepticism in magical situations, reality testing in impossible environments. The lucid mind brings analytical thinking to realms where analysis doesn't apply, creating hybrid states that are neither fully dreaming nor fully logical. The glitches reveal how fluid the boundaries of consciousness really are, how much overlap exists between different states of awareness, how easily the rules of one state can contaminate another. The clean divisions between sleeping and waking start to look more like spectrums than categories. Maybe this explains why some cultures don't distinguish sharply between dreams and reality, why some traditions treat dream experiences as real experiences, why lucid dreamers sometimes struggle to distinguish between dream memories and real memories. The boundaries might be more cultural than neurological. Frequent lucid dreamers report other strange effects: enhanced creativity during waking hours, improved problem-solving abilities, greater emotional regulation, better nightmare management. The skills learned in lucid dreams transfer to waking life in unexpected ways. But there are also costs: sleep fragmentation from excessive lucidity, confusion about reality status of memories, difficulty distinguishing between actual experiences and dream experiences, addiction to dream control that makes waking life feel limiting. The power over dreams can create problems in reality. Maybe the glitches aren't bugs but features, evidence that consciousness is more flexible than rigid categories suggest, that awareness can operate across different states, that the mind can maintain continuity even when the rules change, that lucidity isn't limited to particular states of consciousness. Think about your own dreams, the moments of semi-awareness, partial control, hybrid states that feel neither fully sleeping nor fully waking. Maybe these aren't failed attempts at either state, but successful examples of something in between, consciousness that transcends the sleeping-waking binary. The dream ends, but the lucidity lingers, a sense that awareness can exist in different modes, that consciousness isn't limited to ordinary waking experience, that the mind has capacities that normal states don't reveal, that the boundaries between different types of awareness are more fluid than they appear. Maybe lucid dreaming glitches show the true flexibility of consciousness, the capacity to maintain awareness across different states, the ability to recognize experience as experience regardless of its nature, the potential for consciousness to be lucid, not just in dreams but in all states of being. Wake up, but stay lucid. The observer effect. You try to measure something precisely. The very act of measurement changes what you're measuring. Your observation alters the observed. Your attention transforms the phenomenon. The tool influences the result. The observer becomes part of the observed system rather than separate from it. This is the observer effect. When the act of observation changes what's being observed, when measurement disturbs the system being measured, when consciousness and reality interact in ways that make objective observation impossible, when the boundary between subject and object dissolves. In quantum physics, particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. The act of observation forces them to choose a specific state. Reality becomes definite only when someone pays attention to it. Before observation, the universe remains in quantum limbo, probabilistic rather than determined. But the effect extends beyond particle physics. Social situations change when people know they're being watched. Psychological studies alter behavior through the act of studying it. Even biological systems respond differently when monitored. Observation transforms more than just quantum systems. Maybe consciousness isn't separate from reality, but woven into its fabric. Maybe awareness doesn't just perceive the world, but partially creates it. Maybe the observer effect reveals something fundamental about the relationship between mind and matter, between consciousness and cosmos. Think about self-observation. When you pay attention to your breathing, it changes. When you monitor your thoughts, they alter. When you watch your emotions, they shift. Even internal observation creates change. Even consciousness observing itself transforms itself through the act of observation. The effect raises profound questions. If observation changes reality, can objective truth exist? If consciousness influences what it perceives, how do you distinguish between discovery and creation? If the observer is always part of the system, where does subjectivity end and objectivity begin? Maybe the observer effect explains why meditation changes experience, why therapy transforms problems, why self-reflection generates insight. The act of paying attention doesn't just reveal what's there. It partially creates what becomes there. Awareness participates in the construction of reality. But the effect also suggests that isolation might be impossible, that pure objectivity might be unattainable, that consciousness and cosmos might be so deeply intertwined that separating them distorts both, that the attempt to step outside the system necessarily fails because consciousness is always already inside. Some interpret the observer effect as evidence that consciousness creates reality, that mind is fundamental and matter is emergent, that the universe exists because it's observed rather than being observed because it exists. The observer effect becomes evidence for idealism over materialism. Others see it as revealing the limits of measurement rather than the power of consciousness, that observation disturbs systems without creating them, that the effect shows the boundaries of scientific method rather than the primacy of mind. The observer effect becomes evidence for humility rather than hierarchy. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between. Maybe consciousness and reality co-create each other. Maybe the observer effect shows that separation itself is the illusion, that subject and object, mind and matter, consciousness and cosmos are different aspects of the same underlying process. You observe this moment, and it changes through being observed. Your attention shapes what you're attending to. Your awareness participates in the reality it perceives. The observer effect isn't just about quantum physics. It's about the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Maybe that's why this moment feels different after reading about the observer effect. Not because the words changed reality, but because awareness of the observer effect changes how consciousness observes, changes what it means to be conscious, changes the relationship between the one who observes and what is observed. The effect observes itself. The observer observes the observer. Reality watches reality, watching reality. And in that infinite recursion of observation, maybe something like truth emerges. Not objective truth, separate from consciousness, but participatory truth that includes it. The boundary between observer and observed dissolves. You become part of what you're watching. What you're watching becomes part of you. The observer effect isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to embrace. The recognition that consciousness and cosmos dance together in the eternal act of mutual observation. And the dance continues, watching itself dance. The Zeigarnik Effect. You're watching a movie. Halfway through, someone turns it off. The incomplete story haunts you. You can't stop thinking about what might happen next. Days later, the unfinished narrative still occupies mental space. But movies you've seen to completion fade quickly from memory. Incomplete experiences stick better than finished ones. This is the Zeigarnik Effect. When interrupted or incomplete tasks become more memorable than completed ones. When unfinished business demands more mental attention than finished business. When the brain treats incompleteness as urgency. When closure becomes forgetting rather than resolution. The effect appears everywhere. Students remember interrupted study sessions better than completed ones. Workers obsess over unfinished projects while forgetting completed tasks. Relationships that end abruptly stay vivid while those that conclude naturally fade. The mind clings to what's incomplete and releases what's resolved. Maybe it's about cognitive tension. Unfinished tasks create mental pressure. Incomplete patterns demand resolution. The brain treats open loops as problems requiring attention. Finished tasks relieve tension. Completed patterns feel resolved. The mind can safely forget what no longer needs doing. Restaurants use this effect. Servers remember incomplete orders better than completed ones. Once the food is delivered and paid for, the details vanish from memory. But interrupted service creates sticky memories. Unfinished transactions stay active in awareness until resolved. Writers know about this too. Cliffhangers work because incomplete stories create cognitive tension. Serial narratives exploit the Zeigarnik Effect. Each episode ends with unresolved conflicts. The incomplete patterns keep audiences returning. Closure would kill engagement. But the effect can become problematic. Some people struggle to let go of incomplete tasks. Unfinished projects accumulate mental weight. Open loops multiply until consciousness feels overwhelmed. The mind becomes a museum of unfinished business, an archive of incomplete intentions. Maybe this explains why completion feels so satisfying. Not just because tasks get finished, but because mental space gets freed. Not just because goals get achieved, but because cognitive tension gets released. Completion isn't just about external accomplishment, it's about internal liberation. The effect also suggests that forgetting serves completion, that memory naturally releases what's resolved to make space for what's still pending, that the mind treats completion as permission to forget, that closure enables cognitive housekeeping. Think about your own unfinished business, the conversations that ended abruptly, the projects you never completed, the decisions you never made. They probably occupy more mental space than finished equivalents. The Zeigarnik Effect keeps them alive in memory precisely because they're incomplete. Maybe the solution isn't always finishing everything but learning when to artificially close loops, when to declare things complete even when they're not perfect, when to choose closure over optimization, when to accept good enough to free mental space for what matters more. The unfinished movie stays with you for weeks. The completed ones vanish overnight. The Zeigarnik Effect reveals how much of memory serves future action rather than past recording, how the mind prioritizes what still needs attention over what's already resolved, how forgetting and remembering work together to manage the ongoing project of being conscious. Eigengrau. Close your eyes in complete darkness. What do you see? Not black, not nothing, but a specific shade of gray, slightly warm, slightly textured. This isn't the absence of light, but the presence of something else. The color your brain creates when no visual input arrives. The default state of vision when vision has nothing to process. This is Eigengrau, German for intrinsic gray or own gray, the color of closed-eyed darkness, the visual static your brain generates in the absence of stimulation. Not black, but not quite gray either. Something in between. Something uniquely neurological rather than optical. It's not the same for everyone. Some people see darker Eigengrau, others lighter, some with purple tints, others with green undertones. The brain's default visual state varies between individuals. Each consciousness has its own signature darkness, its own version of visual silence. Maybe Eigengrau reveals something about how vision actually works. That seeing isn't just receiving external light, but actively constructing internal images. That the visual system never truly turns off. That even in darkness, the machinery of sight continues operating, creating something rather than nothing. The phenomenon appears in sensory deprivation, float tanks, dark meditation retreats, caves without light sources. When external stimulation disappears, internal generation becomes visible. The brain reveals its own activity, shows its tendency to create rather than just detect. But Eigengrau isn't random noise. It has structure, consistency, recognizable character. Some describe it as television static, others as swimming particles, others as shifting clouds. The brain imposes patterns on its own baseline activity, creates order from neural chaos. Maybe this explains why total darkness feels unsettling, why pure black seems unnatural, why the absence of light doesn't feel like absence at all, but like presence of something strange. Eigengrau prevents true visual emptiness, ensures that darkness has character rather than void. Think about the moments between sleep and waking, the colors you see with closed eyes, the patterns that drift across internal vision. Maybe those aren't random but variations of Eigengrau, the brain's default state becoming visible during transitions between consciousness and unconsciousness. The color also appears in meditation. Long periods with closed eyes reveal Eigengrau's subtle variations, its gentle movements, its response to attention. Some traditions use this internal vision as focus object, meditation on the color of closed-eye darkness, awareness of awareness itself. Maybe Eigengrau shows that consciousness never experiences true emptiness, that even in the absence of external input, the mind generates content, that seeing is always an active process, that vision creates as much as it detects, that the brain prefers something over nothing, even if something is just its own baseline activity. The darkness behind your eyelids isn't empty. It's full of Eigengrau, full of the brain's own light, full of consciousness creating its own content when reality provides none. The color of internal vision, the shade of mental space, the hue of awareness, aware of itself. Maybe that's the real insight, that consciousness never encounters pure absence, that awareness always has content, even if the content is just awareness itself, that the mind creates rather than discovers, that Eigengrau is the color of creativity itself, the shade of consciousness making something from nothing. Hypnagogic hallucinations. You're drifting towards sleep, not quite awake, not quite dreaming, somewhere in between. And then you see it, a face in the darkness. Hear a voice calling your name. Feel someone touching your shoulder, but you're alone. The room is empty. The sensations are real, but the sources don't exist. These are hypnagogic hallucinations, the strange perceptions that occur at the boundary between waking and sleeping, when consciousness transitions between states and creates experiences that belong to neither, when the brain generates vivid sensations without external stimuli. They can be visual, geometric patterns, moving shapes, human figures, light flashes, complex scenes that feel absolutely real until you fully wake up. The imagery often feels more vivid than dreams, more immediate than memory, more convincing than imagination. They can be auditory, voices speaking your name, music playing, footsteps approaching, phone ringing, sounds so clear and specific you're certain they're real. You might respond verbally only to discover no one was there. The acoustic hallucinations feel externally generated rather than internally created. They can be tactile. Someone touching your skin, pressure on your chest, sensation of falling, feeling of floating, physical experiences without physical causes, touch without contact, sensation without source, the body creating its own stimulation during the transition to sleep. Maybe hypnagogic hallucinations reveal the constructed nature of all perception, that consciousness always generates experience rather than just receiving it, that the difference between hallucination and normal perception might be smaller than we assume, that awareness creates more of reality than reality creates of awareness. The phenomenon suggests that the boundary between dreaming and waking isn't sharp, that consciousness transitions gradually rather than abruptly, that there are intermediate states where dream logic and waking logic coexist, where imagination and perception blend indistinguishably. Some cultures interpret hypnagogic hallucinations as spiritual experiences, visitations from other realms, messages from unconscious wisdom, communications from entities beyond ordinary awareness. The biological explanation doesn't diminish the experiential reality. The neurological doesn't negate the numinous. Artists and inventors sometimes cultivate hypnagogic states. Edison famously napped with steel balls in his hands. When he started dreaming, the balls would drop and wake him. He'd capture the creative imagery from the hypnagogic transition, use the boundary state as source of inspiration. Maybe these hallucinations show creativity in its raw form, consciousness making images without constraint, without logic, without external reference, pure generation of experience, unfiltered creation of content, the mind's capacity to make something from nothing revealed at its most basic level. The voice calling your name fades as you fully wake. The face in the darkness dissolves. The touch on your shoulder disappears. But something remains. A reminder that consciousness creates as much as it perceives, that awareness generates as much as it receives. That the boundary between real and imagined is more fluid than daylight suggests. Maybe hypnagogic hallucinations aren't glitches, but glimpses. Not malfunctions, but revelations. Not problems, but possibilities. Windows into the creative capacity of consciousness itself. Evidence that the mind makes worlds whether it's awake or asleep. Whether it's receiving input or generating output. The transition continues. Consciousness fades towards sleep, but the hallucinations linger in memory. Proof that awareness never stops creating. That perception never stops generating. That consciousness never stops making something from nothing, even when nothing is all it has to work with. The Reminiscence Hump. You try to remember your life chronologically. Childhood appears in fragments. Adulthood feels like yesterday, but adolescence glows with unusual clarity. Those teenage years seem more vivid than decades that followed, more detailed than decades that preceded. As if memory has a sweet spot that everything else fades around. This is the reminiscence hump, the disproportionate recall for events from adolescence and early adulthood, when memories from ages 15 to 25 dominate autobiographical memory, when the most distant past outshines the recent present in vividness and emotional intensity. The effect isn't just nostalgia. Brain imaging shows that memories from this period activate more neural networks, create stronger responses, feel more real because they literally are more real to the brain. The reminiscence hump has biological reality, not just psychological appeal. Maybe it's about identity formation. The teenage years are when personality crystallizes, when preferences solidify, when the self emerges from childhood confusion. These memories feel more important because they made you who you are. They're not just experiences, but foundation stones of identity itself. First experiences cluster in this period. First love, first heartbreak, first independence, first major decisions, first encounters with consequence, first create stronger memories than repetitions. The reminiscence hump might be the memory of becoming rather than just being. Or maybe it's about neuroplasticity. Teenage brains are more changeable, more impressionable. Experiences carve deeper grooves in developing neural networks, create more vivid traces, leave stronger imprints. The reminiscence hump reflects the brain's enhanced capacity for encoding during formative years. But the effect creates problems. It makes people feel like their peak years are behind them. Like current experiences can't compete with past ones, like they're living in the shadow of their younger selves. The reminiscence hump becomes a psychological trap rather than just a memory bias. Maybe the solution is recognizing the construction, that memories from any period feel vivid when you're actually living them, that the present moment is creating future reminiscence humps, that what feels ordinary now will feel extraordinary later. That memory always makes the past more intense than the present. Think about your own teenage experiences. They probably feel more significant than last week's events, more meaningful than yesterday's conversations, more real than this morning's activities. The reminiscence hump makes the distant feel immediate, while the immediate feels distant. But maybe this reveals something profound about time and memory, that significance isn't about recency, but about formation, that importance isn't about proximity, but about identity, that what matters most in memory isn't what happened most recently, but what made you most yourself. The reminiscence hump suggests that life has seasons of meaning, periods when experiences matter more, when memories encode more deeply, when events create lasting rather than temporary impact. Maybe recognizing these seasons helps appreciate them while they're happening rather than only in retrospect. Your teenage years feel more real than your current ones. But maybe that's because you're not done becoming yet. Maybe the reminiscence hump isn't about the past being better, but about the ongoing project of identity formation. Maybe some periods matter more, not because they were perfect, but because they were foundational. And maybe that means the present moment might be creating the next reminiscence hump, that current experiences might someday feel as vivid as teenage ones do now. That memory's strange mathematics will eventually make today feel as significant as yesterday's significance feels today. Temporal illusion in emergencies. The accident unfolds in slow motion. Every detail becomes crystal clear. The approaching collision, the shattering glass, the trajectory of debris. Time stretches impossibly. Seconds become minutes, minutes become hours. Your mind processes information at superhuman speed, while the world crawls forward at glacial pace. This is temporal illusion during crisis, when emergency situations alter the perception of time, when life-threatening moments feel like they last forever, when seconds expand to contain impossible amounts of experience, when consciousness and chronology completely decouple. It's not just about adrenaline. Though adrenaline plays a role, it's about attention becoming total, complete, undivided. When survival depends on awareness, awareness expands to meet the demand. When every detail could matter, every detail gets processed. When nothing can be ignored, everything becomes vivid. Maybe this reveals how time perception actually works. That duration correlates with information density rather than clock measurement, that seconds feel long when they contain more data, that time moves slowly when consciousness moves quickly, that temporal experience is about mental content rather than external measurement. Think about childhood summers. They felt endless, not because they were longer, but because they were denser. Every day contained new experiences, novel situations, unfamiliar sensations. The mind processed more information, so time felt expanded. Less routine meant more subjective duration. But adult time compresses because adult experience becomes routine. Familiar days blend together. Repeated experiences get abbreviated in memory. Less attention means less detail, means shorter subjective duration. Weeks vanish because nothing distinguished them from each other. Crisis breaks routine completely, forces total attention, makes every detail potentially crucial. The mind records everything because everything might matter. Time dilates because consciousness intensifies. The emergency creates the experience of extended time by creating the necessity of extended awareness. Maybe this explains why some people seek dangerous experiences, extreme sports, high-risk activities, near-death encounters, not because they want to die, but because they want to feel maximally alive, want to experience time at full resolution, want to escape the compression of routine through the expansion of crisis. The phenomenon also appears in positive peak experiences, flow states, creative breakthroughs, moments of transcendence. Time distortion isn't limited to negative emergencies, but appears whenever attention becomes complete, when consciousness operates at maximum capacity, regardless of emotional content. But temporal illusion during crisis raises questions about the nature of time itself. If subjective duration can expand dramatically, which time is more real? Clock time or experience time? Mechanical measurement or psychological reality? Maybe time is more subjective than physics suggests. The crisis passes. Time resumes normal speed, but something lingers. A memory of enhanced existence, of seconds that felt like hours, of consciousness operating at peak capacity, of time as experience rather than measurement, of duration as density rather than duration. Maybe that's what time really is. Not the tick of clocks, but the thickness of attention. Not the passage of moments, but the richness of awareness. Maybe temporal illusion during crisis isn't illusion at all. Maybe it's time at its most real, most honest, most true to the nature of consciousness itself. The accident is over, but the memory remains. Not just of what happened, but of how time felt while it was happening. How seconds stretched to accommodate infinity. How consciousness expanded to meet emergency. how time revealed itself to be more flexible than everyday experience suggests, more responsive to awareness than awareness is to time. Pareidolia. You see a face in the clouds, Jesus in toast, the man in the moon, a dog in the wallpaper pattern. Your brain finds meaningful shapes in random stimuli, discovers recognizable forms in chaotic data, creates order from visual noise, imposes familiar patterns on unfamiliar input. This is pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or vague stimuli, when consciousness fills gaps with expectation, when recognition becomes creation, when seeing becomes more about the seer than the seen, when the mind projects structure onto chaos. The effect is automatic, involuntary, immediate. You can't choose not to see the face once you've seen it, can't unsee the pattern once it's been perceived. The brain locks onto the interpretation and makes it feel as real as any other visual experience. More real sometimes than actual intentional patterns. Maybe pareidolia reveals something profound about perception itself, that seeing is always interpretation rather than passive reception, that consciousness actively constructs rather than merely detects, that recognition is creative act rather than simple matching, that vision involves as much projection as reception. The phenomenon appears across cultures and throughout history. Different societies see different things in the same clouds, the same rock formations, the same ink blots, but the tendency to see something meaningful in randomness seems universal, a fundamental feature of how consciousness works rather than cultural accident. Religious pareidolia creates miraculous sightings, sacred figures appearing in natural formations, divine messages in everyday objects, spiritual significance in random events. The brain's pattern-seeking becomes evidence of supernatural presence. Neural tendency becomes theological truth. But pareidolia can also create problems. False medical diagnoses from ambiguous scans, security threats from innocent shadows, criminal evidence from coincidental patterns. The same mechanism that creates art and meaning can also create error and paranoia. Pattern recognition becomes pattern imposition. Maybe the key is awareness, recognizing when you're seeing pareidolia rather than pattern, appreciating the creativity while acknowledging the construction, enjoying the meaning-making without forgetting the making part, understanding that what you see says as much about you as about what you're looking at. Think about your own pareidolia experiences, the shapes you've seen in clouds, the faces in wood grain, the animals in rock formations. These aren't failures of perception but examples of consciousness doing what it does best, finding meaning, creating order, making sense from senselessness. Artists use pareidolia deliberately. Abstract paintings that suggest without depicting, music that evokes without describing, poetry that implies without stating. They know that the mind will fill gaps with meaning, that consciousness prefers interpretation to emptiness, that pareidolia is creativity's natural partner. The face in the toast isn't really there, but the seeing is real. The meaning-making is genuine. The pattern recognition is authentic, even when the pattern isn't. Maybe pareidolia isn't about false seeing, but about creative seeing, about consciousness participating in the construction of what it perceives. Maybe that's true for all perception. Maybe everything you see involves some element of pareidolia, some degree of projection, some amount of creative interpretation. Maybe the boundary between objective detection and subjective construction is more fluid than it appears. The cloud face dissolves as the wind changes. The pattern disappears, but something remains. Evidence that consciousness is creative rather than just receptive. That seeing involves making as much as finding. That perception is collaborative project between mind and world rather than passive recording of external reality. Automaticity. You drive home from work. Arrive in your driveway with no memory of the journey. Your hands turned the wheel. Your foot worked the pedals. Your eyes tracked the road. But consciousness was somewhere else entirely. Your body navigated traffic while your mind wandered. Automatic behavior without conscious oversight. This is automaticity. When well-learned skills operate without conscious attention. When practice makes behavior unconscious rather than just competent. When expertise means not having to think about what you're doing. When consciousness delegates routine tasks to run themselves. It happens with many activities. Typing words without thinking about finger movements. Walking without planning each step. Playing familiar music without reading notes. Speaking your native language without constructing sentences. Complex behaviors become as automatic as breathing, as unconscious as heartbeats. Maybe automaticity reveals how much of life runs on autopilot. How many decisions get made below awareness? How many actions happen without conscious choice? The activities that once required total attention become background processes. Consciousness freed for other tasks while the body handles routine. But automaticity can be unsettling. The realization that you've been absent from your own experience, that significant chunks of time passed without awareness, that you can live parts of your life without being present for them. That consciousness is more optional than it feels. Think about learning to drive. Every action required deliberate thought, turn signal, check mirrors, adjust speed, monitor traffic. The cognitive load was overwhelming, but practice gradually automated the components, reduced conscious involvement, made complex behavior effortless and unconscious. Maybe this is how all expertise develops, from effortful attention to effortless automaticity, from conscious control to unconscious competence. The journey from beginner to expert is really the journey from awareness to automation, from thinking to not needing to think. But automaticity has costs. Automatic behaviors are hard to change, hard to examine, hard to improve once they become unconscious. The efficiency comes at the price of flexibility. The ease comes at the cost of adaptability. Automaticity optimizes for repetition rather than innovation. The phenomenon also appears in social behavior. Automatic responses to familiar situations, unconscious reactions to emotional triggers, habitual patterns of interaction that run without awareness. Much of personality might be automaticity, repeated behaviors that feel like character traits. Maybe recognizing automaticity is the first step to reclaiming choice. Noticing when behavior runs on autopilot, becoming aware of unconscious patterns, bringing automatic processes back into consciousness when change is needed, using awareness to override automation. But maybe automaticity also has benefits. It frees mental resources for creativity, for problem solving, for experiencing beauty, for being present with what matters while letting routine handle itself. Maybe the goal isn't to eliminate automaticity, but to choose it wisely. You arrive home safely, despite the absent-minded journey. Automaticity kept you alive while consciousness wandered. The unconscious competence that develops through practice. The efficiency that comes from not having to think about every detail. The gift of expertise that makes complex behavior simple. Maybe that's the real insight. That consciousness and unconsciousness work together rather than competing. That awareness and automaticity are partners rather than rivals. That the mind works best when it can delegate routine to focus on novelty. When it can trust automatic systems to handle predictable tasks while directing attention to unpredictable opportunities. The journey home was unconscious, but the arrival was conscious. Maybe that's how life works best. Automaticity, handling the routine. Awareness engaging with the significant, both systems working together to create competent, efficient, adaptable behavior that can respond to both the expected and unexpected. Cryptophasia. Twin babies babble to each other in sounds that make no sense to adults, but they respond to each other appropriately. Laugh at the right moments, take turns speaking their private language, communicate meaning through patterns adults can't decode. They've created their own linguistic system. Secret words in a secret world. This is cryptophasia, also called idioglossia. The phenomenon of twins developing private languages. When isolated communication creates unique linguistic systems, when shared experience generates shared meaning that outsiders can't access, when language becomes truly private rather than socially shared. The phenomenon appears most often in twins who spend extensive time together with limited adult interaction. They create vocabularies, grammar rules, communication patterns that serve their specific needs. Their private language becomes as functional as any public language, sometimes more expressive for their particular experiences. Maybe cryptophagia reveals something profound about language itself, that communication systems emerge naturally from shared experience, that meaning gets created through interaction rather than inherited through culture, that language is more inventive than imitative, more creative than copied. Most private languages disappear once twins enter broader social worlds, school, peer groups, extended family interactions. The need for public communication overwhelms private systems. The unique languages get abandoned for socially shared ones. The secret words fade into family memories. But sometimes traces remain. Inside jokes that no one else understands. References that only make sense to those who live through particular experiences. Shared meaning that transcends ordinary language. Maybe all close relationships develop elements of cryptophagia, private communication systems that outsiders can't fully access. The phenomenon raises questions about language acquisition. Do children learn language or create it? Do they copy adult speech or invent communication systems? Maybe language learning involves more creativity than imitation, more generation than reproduction, more making than taking. Think about your own private languages, family expressions that don't translate, relationship jokes that require extensive context, professional jargon that excludes outsiders, friend group references that create insider-outsider boundaries. Maybe everyone participates in multiple cryptophasias throughout life. Some linguists study cryptophagia to understand language origins, how communication systems emerge from scratch, how meaning gets established through interaction, how grammar develops from repeated patterns. The twin languages become windows into how language itself might have originally emerged. But cryptophagia also shows the power of shared experience to create shared meaning. That communication works best between people who've lived similar lives, who share similar contexts, who understand similar references. Maybe all language is somewhat private, somewhat dependent on shared experience for full comprehension. The secret language fades. As the twins grow older, public communication becomes more important than private expression. The unique words get replaced by socially standard ones. But something remains, a memory of pure communication, of meaning created rather than inherited, of language as invention rather than imitation. Maybe cryptophagia reveals the creative potential in all communication, that every conversation involves some element of private language creation, that meaning gets made fresh in each interaction rather than simply transmitted. That language lives not in dictionaries but in the dynamic space between minds reaching toward understanding. The twins speak normally now, but they created something unprecedented, a linguistic system that existed nowhere else. A communication bridge that connected their unique experience, evidence that language is more flexible than textbooks suggest, more creative than grammar rules imply, more alive than preservation suggests. The McGurk Effect. You watch someone say ga ga ga, but hear da da da. The visual information from lip movements overrides the auditory information from sound waves. Your brain fuses sight and sound into a perception that matches neither input perfectly. The combination creates something new, something that exists only in the interaction between senses. This is the McGurk Effect. When visual speech information changes what you hear, when lip reading influences listening, when seeing shapes, hearing, when perception becomes multisensory integration rather than simple detection, when consciousness combines inputs in ways that transform both. The effect is automatic, involuntary, persistent, Even when you know it's happening, you can't stop it. The brain insists on integrating visual and auditory speech information, creates unified percepts from multiple inputs, refuses to keep the senses separate when they're providing relevant information about the same event. Maybe the McGurk effect reveals something profound about perception itself. That consciousness doesn't just receive information from individual senses, but actively combines inputs to create coherent experience. That seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, and smelling work together rather than independently. That perception is creative synthesis rather than passive collection. The effect appears strongest in noisy environments. When auditory information is unclear, visual information becomes more influential. When lip movements are visible, hearing becomes more accurate. The brain uses whatever information is available to construct the most probable interpretation of what's being communicated. But the McGurk effect can create problems. In situations where visual and auditory information conflict, perception becomes unreliable. Ventriloquism exploits this. Dubbed movies create temporary confusion. Any mismatch between sight and sound can distort understanding. The brain's attempt to create coherence can sometimes create incoherence. Maybe this explains why face-to-face communication feels richer than phone conversations, why video calls work better than audio calls, why reading lips improves hearing, why watching speakers enhances comprehension. The McGurk effect shows that speech perception naturally involves multiple senses working together. Think about your own listening experiences. How much easier it is to understand someone when you can see their face. How lip movements help clarify unclear words. How visual context improves auditory processing. Maybe hearing was never purely auditory. Maybe all perception is multisensory, even when it seems to involve only one sense. The effect also appears in other sensory combinations. Touch influencing taste, smell affecting hearing, vision changing balance. The brain constantly integrates information across sensory channels, creates unified experience from divided inputs, makes perception feel seamless when it's actually deeply collaborative. Maybe the McGurk effect shows the constructed nature of all experience. That what you perceive isn't what your senses detect, but what your brain makes from detection. That consciousness actively builds reality rather than passively receiving it. That perception is creative act rather than simple reception. The person keeps saying ga ga ga, but you keep hearing da da da. The McGurk effect creates a new reality from conflicting inputs, shows the brain's commitment to integration over accuracy, to coherence over fidelity, to unified experience over divided sensation. Maybe that's how all consciousness works, not as collection of separate sensory streams, but as integrated synthetic experience, not as passive reception of external information, but as active construction of internal reality. The McGurk effect isn't just about speech perception, it's about the fundamental nature of awareness itself. The senses work together to create experience that transcends any single sensory input. Vision enhances hearing. Hearing enhances vision. The combination creates something richer than either alone. Maybe that's the real lesson. That consciousness is collaborative. That perception is synthesis. That experience is always more than the sum of its sensory parts. The Capgras Delusion. She looks exactly like your mother. Same face, same voice, same mannerisms. But something is wrong. This isn't your mother. This is an imposter. A replacement. A duplicate who has somehow taken your mother's place. The logical mind knows this makes no sense. But the feeling of wrongness persists. Overwhelming, undeniable, terrifying. This is Capgras Delusion. When familiar people feel like strangers wearing familiar faces, when recognition occurs without emotional connection, when the cognitive and emotional aspects of identification become disconnected, when knowing someone looks right but feeling like everything is wrong creates the conviction that loved ones have been replaced by imposters. The delusion typically results from brain injury, damage to connections between face recognition areas and emotional processing regions. The face gets recognized correctly, but the recognition doesn't trigger appropriate emotional response. The disconnect between identification and feeling creates the interpretation that the person must be an imposter. Maybe Capgras Delusion reveals something profound about how relationships actually work. That love isn't just recognition, but also feeling. That knowing someone involves emotion as much as cognition. That the warmth of familiarity is as important as the accuracy of identification. That relationships exist in feelings as much as facts. The delusion can be heartbreaking for families. To be seen as an imposter by someone you love. To have your identity denied by someone who raised you. To be treated as a stranger by someone who once knew you better than anyone. The condition destroys relationships by severing the emotional connections that make relationships meaningful. But maybe Capgras also shows the complexity of human recognition. That identifying someone involves multiple brain systems working together. That face processing, emotional response, and memory integration must coordinate perfectly for normal relationship functioning. That feeling like you know someone requires more than just knowing who they are. Think about your own recognition experiences. How people feel different in different contexts. How emotional states change how familiar faces look. How stress or fatigue can make loved ones feel temporarily foreign. Maybe everyone experiences mild versions of the disconnect that becomes extreme in Capgras. The delusion suggests that consciousness relies heavily on emotional validation of cognitive recognition, that thinking you know someone isn't enough, that you must also feel like you know them. That identification requires both intellectual certainty and emotional confirmation. That love is a form of recognition that transcends mere identification. Some people with Capgras recognize loved ones normally over phone calls, but not in person. The voice triggers appropriate emotional response, while the face doesn't. This suggests that the delusion is specifically about visual emotional disconnection rather than general relationship confusion. Different sensory channels maintain different levels of emotional connection. Maybe the condition reveals how much of relationship exists in feeling rather than knowing. How much of love is emotional recognition rather than factual identification. How much of human connection depends on the ineffable sense of rightness that accompanies genuine recognition. That knowing someone's identity isn't the same as knowing them. The feeling of wrongness gradually fades for some people as brain connections heal or adapt. Emotional recognition slowly returns. The imposter becomes mother again. The familiar feeling reattaches to familiar faces. But something has been revealed about the fragility of recognition, about how easily the sense of knowing someone can be disrupted. Maybe Capgras Delusion shows that all recognition is more fragile than it feels, that the sense of knowing someone depends on complex neural processes that can be disrupted, that feeling like you know someone is as much achievement as given, that the emotional warmth of familiarity is as important as the cognitive accuracy of identification. The face looks right but feels wrong. The identification is correct but incomplete. Capgras creates the terrible gap between knowing and feeling, between recognition and relationship, between seeing someone and truly seeing them. A reminder that love requires more than identification, that relationship needs feeling as much as knowing, that being human means needing both cognition and emotion to make sense of each other. In the end, these glitches in human experience reveal something beautiful about consciousness itself. That awareness is more creative than receptive. That perception is more constructed than detected. That reality is more collaborative than imposed. That being conscious means being constantly amazed by the strangeness of existence itself. And maybe that's the deepest glitch of all. That consciousness can observe itself. That awareness can be aware of its own awareness. That the observer can observe the observer observing, that this moment of reading about consciousness is itself, consciousness contemplating its own nature. The real glitch isn't in the system. The real glitch is that there's a system capable of recognizing glitches, a reality that can question reality, an awareness that can be amazed by its own existence. Sleep comes. But the mystery remains. The endless wonder of being conscious in a universe that somehow created consciousness. The perpetual glitch of existence examining itself. The eternal puzzle of awareness being aware. Rest well in the strangeness. Dream deeply in the mystery. Wake gently to the ongoing miracle of being conscious at all. We've wandered through the strange edges of experience, where memory bends, perception stutters, and reality reveals seams you didn't expect to see. Each glitch, whether in thought, time, or sensation, shows that consciousness isn't seamless. It's fragile, creative, and always a little unstable. If this journey left you curious, unsettled, or quietly amazed, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or offering a like. It helps keep these explorations alive. And thank you for spending this time here, for listening, for watching, and for letting these glitches ripple through your own awareness.